Somewhere in the dry scrubland of Chubut province in southern Argentina, a man is walking a fence line. The year is 2012. The wind off the Patagonian steppe is cold and constant, and the ground beneath his boots is pale, stony and old. He's a ranch hand, not a scientist. He's thinking about sheep or about the long drive back or about nothing much at all. And then, half buried in the eroding slope of a low hill, he sees a shape that does not belong. It is dark against the pale rock. It is curved and smooth and far too large to be a stone. It is a bone. A single fossilized thigh bone, longer than the man is tall. When the museum team from Trelew finally arrives, it takes them days simply to free that one femur from the earth, and that femur, it turns out, belonged to an animal called Patagotitan majorum, a creature whose reconstructed skeleton stretches longer than a Boeing 737 airliner parked on a runway. Somewhere near 120 feet from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail. This is where we begin tonight. Let that number settle over you before we go on. A living thing, warm-blooded, breathing, walking on 4 legs, as long as a passenger jet. And here is the detail that turns a large fact into an almost unbelievable one. That first femur was not alone. At a single quarry near the ranch called La Flecha, paleontologists uncovered the bones of at least 6 individual Patagotitan, tangled together in the same ancient sediment. 6 of the largest animals ever to walk on land, found in one place, described formally in 2017 by José Carballido and his colleagues. 6 giants, lying down together in the rock, waiting 100 million years for a man on a fence line to notice one dark curve of bone. Stay with me for a while tonight. There is no hurry in anything we're about to do. Over the next few hours, you and I are going to walk slowly up a ladder of size, from the merely enormous toward the almost impossible, meeting 10 of the largest creatures that ever stood on solid ground. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to hold the numbers in your head. Let the names and the measurements drift past you like weather. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of the Cretaceous, among the titanosaurs, that is exactly what this is for. But before we can climb that ladder, we have to agree on how it is built. Because the moment you try to name the largest creature that ever lived, you run into a problem of definition, and the honest thing to do is to solve it out loud together right at the start. The title of tonight's walk is The Largest Creatures That Ever Walked the Earth. Walked. That single word does a great deal of quiet work. It means we are staying on dry land. It means feet and legs and the pull of gravity through a spine and into the ground. And that rules out, immediately and deliberately, the true heavyweight champion of all life on this planet. Because the largest animal that has ever existed, as far as anyone knows, is alive right now, in the oceans of our own age. The blue whale. A blue whale can reach nearly 100 feet long and weigh close to 200 tons, which is more than any dinosaur we will meet tonight, by a wide and comfortable margin. But a blue whale has never walked anywhere. It is held up by water. Its enormous body is cradled, weightless, in the sea, and if you were to strand one on a beach, its own weight would slowly crush the breath out of it. Water is what makes that size possible, so the whale sits outside our rules, and we set it gently aside. For the same reason, we leave out the great marine reptiles of the age of dinosaurs, the ichthyosaurs, the pliosaurs, the mosasaurs, some of them longer than a school bus, all of them magnificent, but they swam. They did not walk, and we leave out Shastasaurus and the giant pliosaurs and every leviathan that ever moved by fin and flipper rather than foot. Tonight is about weight carried on legs. Tonight is about what gravity allows. That boundary matters more than it might seem, and here is why. On land, size is not free. Every pound of an animal has to be lifted and moved and supported by bone and muscle against the constant downward pull of the earth. There is a ceiling somewhere, point past which legs would snap and hearts would fail, and the creatures we are going to meet lived close to that ceiling. They are interesting precisely because they tell us how big a walking thing can possibly get. The whale tells us about water. The titanosaur tells us about the limit of land. Those are two different questions, and tonight we are asking only the second one. So, land only. Feet on the ground. That is our first rule, and it is a clean one. The second rule is harder, and it is about honesty. Here is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this entire subject. We do not actually know how much these animals weighed. Not the way you know your own weight when you stand on a scale in the morning. For the very largest sauropods, the long-necked plant-eaters that dominate the top of our list, almost every weight you have ever heard quoted is an estimate. A careful, educated, argued-over estimate, but an estimate all the same. Nobody has ever weighed an Argentinosaurus. Nobody ever will, and the reason is simple and a little sad. We almost never find a complete one. The largest animals are, in a cruel irony, among the rarest fossils, because a bone has to survive an astonishing sequence of accidents to reach us at all. The animal has to die in the right place, near water, near sediment, somewhere it can be buried quickly before scavengers and weather scatter it. It has to be covered and pressed and mineralized over millions of years. It has to survive the slow grinding of the rock around it, the heat, the pressure, the folding of continents. And then, at the very end, it has to be pushed back up to the surface at the exact moment that something with eyes and curiosity happens to be walking past. For an animal 100 feet long, all of that has to happen to a body the size of a house. Usually it does not. Usually what we find is a fragment. A few vertebrae, a partial limb, a scatter of ribs. Argentinosaurus huincalensis, an animal often crowned the heaviest land creature that ever lived, is known from only about 9 incomplete backbones, a broken thigh bone, part of a lower leg, and some pieces of rib. That is it. From that handful of bones, paleontologists reconstruct an animal longer than 3 school buses. So when someone tells you, with great confidence, that a particular dinosaur weighed exactly 77 tons, the calm and honest response is a small, warm skepticism. How, you might reasonably ask, could anyone possibly know that? Tonight I want to actually answer that question because the answer is one of the most quietly clever things that science does. How do you weigh an animal that has been dead for 90 million years, an animal you have never seen whole, an animal that exists only as a few dark bones in a drawer? There are 2 main ways, and they disagree with each other, and that disagreement is the whole reason sauropod sizes are so fiercely contested. The first method is beautifully simple. You measure the circumference of the weight-bearing limb bones, the femur in the hind leg and the humerus in the front. Think of it this way. Your leg bones are thicker than a mouse's leg bones, not because you are a different shape, but because they carry more load. Across all 4-legged animals alive today, from a house cat to an elephant, there is a remarkably steady relationship between how thick the leg bones are and how heavy the animal is. Bone, after all, has to be strong enough to hold up the body standing on it, and no stronger, because extra bone is expensive to grow and heavy to carry. So you take that steady relationship measured from hundreds of living animals, and you extend it. You measure the circumference of a fossil femur, you feed it into the equation, and out comes a weight. This is the method that gives Argentinosaurus its famous figure of around 73 tons, from a rigorous scaling study published in 2004. It is elegant, and it works from just a single well-preserved leg bone. The second method is more like sculpture. You take the skeleton, or as much of it as you have, and you build a 3-dimensional model of it, either in clay or more often now inside a computer. Then you wrap that skeleton in muscle and skin and fat and lung and gut, filling out the body to a lifelike shape, and you calculate the total volume of that shape. Volume times density gives you mass, the same way you could work out the weight of a bathtub of water if you knew its size. This is the volumetric method, and its great strength is that it uses the whole animal, not just one bone. The trouble is that these 2 methods, applied to the very same skeleton, can give you answers that differ by nearly a factor of 2. And there is no cleaner example of that than an animal called Dreadnoughtus schreini, one of the most complete giant skeletons ever found, which we will meet properly later in our walk. When it was described in 2014, the limb bone method gave it a weight of around 59 tons. A year later, In 2015, a different team built a volumetric model of the same bones and came back with a figure closer to 30 to 40 tons. 30 tons of difference out of the same animal. The original describer disputed the lower number publicly. That argument is still not settled. It is a live, genuine, unresolved disagreement playing out in the scientific journals about how you weigh a thing that is not there to step on a scale. I tell you this not to make the numbers feel useless, but to make them feel honest. When I give you a weight tonight, I will try to give you the range, and to tell you where the argument lies. These animals were real, and they were staggeringly large, and we can say that with total confidence. Exactly how large is a question we are still patiently working out. Now, let me try to make one of these creatures real to you, not as a number, but as a thing you could stand beside in the dark. Picture that first femur again, the one from the fence line in Chubut. A titanosaur thigh bone can stand taller than you are. Not the whole leg, just the single bone between hip and knee. Imagine it stood upright on the ground in front of you like a pillar. You would have to tip your head back to see the top of it. You could not reach the upper end with your outstretched hand. One bone, and it dwarfs you the way a doorway dwarfs a beetle, and that is one bone out of more than 200 in the body. Now picture the whole animal. It is early morning on a Cretaceous floodplain in what will one day be Patagonia. The air is warm and a little damp. There are ferns underfoot and low conifers, and the first flowering plants just beginning to spread across the world, though there is no grass anywhere. Not yet, not for tens of millions of years. And moving through this landscape slowly, with the unhurried patience of something that has no reason to fear anything, is an animal that weighs as much as 10 African elephants leaning together. 60 tons, maybe more. Its foot is the size of a large round table. When it sets that foot down into the wet floodplain mud, the ground does not so much crunch as sigh. A low thud you would feel through the soles of your own feet before you heard it with your ears. It is not fast, it is not aggressive, it is not hunting anything. It is, in the plainest sense, a machine for turning plants into more of itself, and it spends nearly every waking hour eating, stripping foliage from the trees, with a mouth that never chews, swallowing leaves whole down a neck longer than most living rooms. This is what a giant actually was, not a monster. A slow, warm, enormous grazer, walking through the morning mist, deliberate as a cloud. We should say something quiet here about sound, because it is tempting in the dark to imagine these animals calling to one another across the plain, low booming voices rolling through the ferns like the calls of elephants. It is a lovely image. It may even be true. But you should know that there is no fossil evidence for it at all. Soft tissue, the throat and the lungs and whatever made noise, almost never survives. Any deep call we imagine is an educated guess borrowed from living animals, not something the rocks have told us. So let the plain be mostly quiet tonight. The wind in the conifers, the sigh of a foot in the mud, the tearing of leaves, and if you like, somewhere at the edge of hearing, a sound we can only guess at. There is one more thing to understand before we start climbing, and it is the secret that made all of this possible. How does an animal even get this big without collapsing under its own weight? Part of the answer is hidden inside the bones themselves. Sauropod vertebrae were not solid. They were riddled with air pockets, hollowed out from the inside by an air sac system much like the one inside a living bird. The average backbone of one of these giants was something like 60% air by volume. Air, where you would expect solid bone. It is the reason a neck 40 feet long did not simply break the animal that carried it. Lightened from within, the skeleton could reach sizes that solid bone never could. When you hear, later tonight, about necks that seem impossible, remember that they were built like the bones of a bird, full of breath. So that is our ground, land only, because we are talking about weight carried on legs against the pull of the earth, not cradled in the sea. Honesty about the numbers, because the largest of these creatures are known from fragments, and their weights are careful reconstructions rather than measured facts. Two methods of weighing them, limb bone and volume, that still argue with each other, and a body plan, hollowed out and air-filled, that let living things grow to a scale the land has never seen before or since. That is the whole framework. Everything else tonight is just walking slowly up the ladder, meeting one giant at a time, and here is a gentle surprise to end this first stretch on before we take our first real step. When you line up the largest land animals of all time and sort them honestly by weight, the creature at the bottom of our list, the smallest of our 10 giants, the one we meet first, is not a dinosaur at all. We think of the age of giants as the age of dinosaurs, and for good reason. But long after the last titanosaur fell silent, tens of millions of years after the great extinction that ended the Cretaceous, the mammals had their own attempt at bigness. The world grew warm and wooded again. New kinds of large browsers spread across the continents, and in the open woodlands of Central Asia, during the long, slow epoch called the Oligocene, there lived a mammal so large that for most of the last century it held the crown as the heaviest land mammal that ever existed. It was a relative of the rhinoceros, and it is the first rung on our ladder, the smallest of the truly colossal. To meet it, we have to turn away for a while from the dinosaurs and their contested tonnages and walk instead through a warm Asian forest under a gentler sun. Before you meet the giants one by one, it is worth resting on a quieter question. How do you weigh an animal that has been dead for 70 million years? There is no scale wide enough to hold it. There is no animal left to step onto one. What you have instead is a scatter of bones in a museum drawer, some cracked, many missing entirely. And still, the books will tell you a titanosaur weighed 60 tons, as though someone had once checked. No one ever checked. Someone calculated. Let me walk you through how, slowly, because the number that follows a giant's name is stranger than it looks. There are 2 main ways to do it, and they disagree. The first is old and simple and quietly clever. It begins with a single fact about standing up. On land, your legs carry your weight, all of it, every moment you're not lying down. A heavier animal needs thicker leg bones, or those bones would crack under the load. So the thickness of a limb is not decoration. It is a structural report on how much the animal weighed. Read the report, and you read the weight. In practice, you take 2 bones, the humerus, which is the upper arm, the femur, which is the thigh. You wrap a tape around the narrow middle of each, the shaft, where the bone is at its slimmest, and you measure the distance around. That is the circumference. You add the 2 numbers together, then you carry that single figure to an equation. The equation is the interesting part. It was not invented from theory. It was built by measuring living animals, hundreds of them, creatures whose weight is known because they can be placed on a scale. Elephants, buffalo, rhinos, horses, mice. For each one, you record the limb circumference and the true body mass, and you plot them against each other. A pattern appears, a smooth curve running from the smallest to the largest. Thicker legs, heavier body, in a relationship steady enough to trust. The curve becomes a formula, and a formula does not care whether the animal is alive. Feed it the combined circumference of 2 fossil bones, and it hands back a mass in pounds. It is a beautiful shortcut. 2 measurements, 1 equation, an answer. You do not need the whole skeleton. You do not need the shape of the belly or the length of the tail. You need 2 well-preserved leg bones, and the nerve to trust that a dinosaur obeyed the same load-bearing rules as an elephant. There is a weakness hidden inside that trust. The formula was built from mammals shaped like mammals, and a sauropod was shaped like nothing now alive, a small head on an enormous neck, a body carried between 4 pillars. When you push a shape that strange through a curve built from familiar animals, you cannot be certain the answer still holds. Most of the time, bone is bone, and gravity has not changed. But the doubt never quite leaves the room. The second method distrusts the shortcut and takes the long road instead. Here you do not reach for an equation. You rebuild the animal. You take every bone you have, scan it, and assemble a digital skeleton inside a computer, jointed and posed as it stood in life. Then comes the hard part, the part that is more sculpture than arithmetic. You clothe the bones in a body. You lay muscle over the frame, drape fat and skin across the muscle, fill the chest and the belly with the soft bulk of organs. When the shape is finished, the computer measures the volume of the whole solid, the number of cubic feet the living animal would have filled. Multiply that volume by density, by how heavy a cubic foot of living flesh tends to be, and you have a weight. Picture the sculpting step as a kind of shrink wrapping. Imagine taking a wet cloth and pressing it down over the bare skeleton, smoothing it along the ribs, into the hollows, across the great slab of the hip. Where you press the cloth tight against the bone, the animal is lean. Where you let it stand away, you are guessing at muscle, at fat, at the swell of a gut the size of a small room. Press the cloth too close and your animal starves. Let it billow and your animal balloons. Every reconstruction is a decision about how hard to press, made bone by bone, and no two paleontologists press exactly alike. That is where the two methods part company, and the gap between them can be enormous. Consider Dreadnoughtus shrani. It is the best case anyone could ask for, a giant titanosaur from southern Patagonia, more than 70% complete by bone count, the most complete skeleton of any animal this size ever found. If any giant could be weighed with confidence, it is this one. In 2014, the team that described it, led by Kenneth Lacovara, ran the limb bone method. They took the circumference of the humerus and the femur, fed it to the equation, and read off a mass of about 59 tons, close to 65 US tons, the weight of roughly a dozen elephants standing in one place. Then, in 2015, a second team looked again. Bates and his colleagues built the digital body instead, the shrink-wrapped model, and computed the volume the animal would have filled. Their number came back far lighter, somewhere near 30 to 40 tons, 33 to 44 US tons. Not a small correction, roughly half. The same bones, the same animal, the same drawer of fossils, and two respected teams arriving at weights that differ by the mass of several elephants. The original describer disputed the lower figure. The disagreement has never been fully resolved. It sits there still, a factor of 2, unsettled, in the best skeleton we have. And notice what that means. Completeness did not save us. Having most of the bones did not force the two answers together, because the argument was never really about the bones. It was about the flesh we have to imagine around them. And this is before the strangest complication of all, which is that a sauropod was not solid. You might assume that inside a body that huge, the bones at least a dense, packed cores of solid material. They were not. Sauropod bones, especially the vertebrae of the neck and back, were riddled with air. Hollowed out, honeycombed, invaded by pouches from a bird-like system of air sacs that reached deep into the skeleton itself. When Matt Weddell measured how much of a sauropod vertebra was bone and how much was empty space, the answer was startling. The average vertebra was around 60% air by volume, more hole than wall. A great column of neck that from the outside looked like a solid tree trunk was, on the inside, closer to the airy scaffolding of a bird's bones, all thin struts and open chambers, or the bubbled crust of something baked and full of pockets. This is wonderful for the animal, and a quiet nightmare for the person weighing it. The air is exactly what lets sauropods grow so long. Lighten the skeleton, and a neck can stretch far beyond what solid bone could hold up, perhaps 2/3 longer for the same weight of material. But when you're trying to compute a mass, that trapped air becomes a question you cannot see. How much of this body was bone? How much was flesh? How much was nothing at all, just pockets of breath threaded through the frame? Guess that the animal was densely built and it weighs more. Guess that it was full of air and it weighs less. The bones do not tell you which, not exactly. And so the guess goes straight into the answer. So hold the numbers you are about to hear a little more loosely than you might. When you're told that one of these creatures weighed 70 tons, understand what that sentence really is. It is not a measurement. Nobody weighed it. It is an argument. carefully made, resting on which bones survived, which method was chosen, how hard someone pressed the imagined muscle onto the frame, and how much empty air they allowed inside the chest. Change the method and the number moves. Change the assumptions and it moves again. The best of these figures come with a wide, honest range around them, and the honest scientists are the ones who show you the range instead of hiding it behind a single confident digit. None of this makes the giants smaller. It makes them harder to pin down, which is a different thing, and in its way a more interesting one. These were real animals, and they truly were immense, heavier than anything that walks the land today by a margin that is not in doubt. What remains uncertain is the last stretch of the scale, the final ton, or 2, or 10, the precise place each one sits on a balance we cannot build. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is what honesty looks like when the subject has been gone for tens of millions of years and left only its bones behind to argue on its behalf. Keep that in mind as we begin, and the list becomes less a set of hard weights and more a slow procession of estimates, each one a careful conversation between a skeleton and the people who found it. We will move gently from the smaller of the great giants toward the largest, from warm-blooded browsers to the colossal titanosaurs of Patagonia. And we will begin with an animal that surprises people, because it is not a dinosaur at all. So the first giant on our list is not a dinosaur at all, but a hornless cousin of the rhinoceros that browsed the warm woodlands of ancient Asia. So the first giant on our list is not a dinosaur at all, but a hornless cousin of the rhinoceros that browsed the warm woodlands of ancient Asia. Picture the ground beneath your feet as it was some 30 million years ago, in the epoch geologists call the Oligocene. This is Central Asia, though none of the borders you know exist yet. The land that will one day be Kazakhstan and Mongolia, Pakistan and Western China, lies open under a warm and drying sky. The air is dry and mild, and moving through the scrub, slow and unbothered, is the largest land mammal that has ever lived. Its name is Paraceratherium. Older books and older museum labels give it other names: Indracotherium, Baluchitherium, relics of a time when scattered bones from different digs were each christened separately before anyone realized they belonged to the same kind of animal. Say the name slowly and let it settle. Paraceratherium, a hornless relative of the rhino, stretched and lengthened into something that would dwarf any rhinoceros alive today. There is nothing on land in the modern world that comes close. Let yourself stand near one, in your imagination, and take the measure of it honestly. At the shoulder it rose somewhere between 16 and 18 feet. Think of that height not as a number, but as a wall of warm flesh in front of you. If you stood at its front leg and reached up with your open hand, your raised fingertips would not touch its elbow. You would be standing at its knee, a small warm creature looking up along a column of muscle and bone, and the joint where the leg folds would still be above your head. The shoulder itself would rise past you like the eaves of a 2-story roof, that high line where the wall of a tall house meets the sky. From nose to hip it measured roughly 30 to 36 feet long, and it carried its weight on legs built like the pillars of a hall. The most careful modern estimates place its mass at around 20 tons. 20 tons is a difficult thing to feel, so hold it this way. That is the weight of 3 or 4 full-grown African elephants gathered into a single body, standing on 4 feet, breathing slowly in the Oligocene warmth. Now 20 tons is a large and honest number, and it deserves a note of caution, because the figure was not always given that way. For much of the 20th century, reconstructions of Paraceratherium were built from a composite, bones from more than one individual assembled into a single mounted skeleton, and some of those reconstructions suggested a mass as high as 34 tons. That larger figure travelled far. It appeared in popular books and record lists and settled into the way people imagined the animal. But a careful reassessment by the researcher Asier Larramendi, published in 2016, set that inflated number aside. When you build a body from mismatched parts and stretch every measurement toward its maximum, you tend to end up with an animal heavier than any that truly walked. The steadier estimate, near 20 tons, is the one to keep. It is smaller than the legend, and it is still almost beyond belief. To understand this animal, you have to understand the world it fed in, because it was a world stranger than you might expect. There were no grasslands. None. The vast open plains of waving grass that cover so much of the earth today, the prairies and steppes and savannas, simply did not exist yet in the form you know. Grass as a widespread, ground-covering carpet had not yet risen to rule the open country. So when you look out across this Oligocene landscape, you do not see a green lawn stretching to the horizon. You see something patchier and softer. Open woodland and scrub, scattered trees and shrubs, a mosaic of foliage rather than turf. This was a transitional world, caught between the wetter forests of the epoch before it and the colder, grass-covered steppes that were still millions of years away. And into that in-between landscape, Paraceratherium fit like a key into a lock. It was a browser, not a grazer. It did not lower its head to crop grass because there was little grass to crop. Instead, it lifted its head and it fed on leaves. Here the great height stops being a curiosity and becomes a strategy. With a neck and skull raised 16 to 18 feet off the ground, and very likely a flexible upper lip to strip and gather branches, Paraceratherium could reach into the crowns of trees that no other animal of its time could touch. Every leaf above the reach of the smaller browsers, every tender shoot in the upper branches, belonged to it alone. It was, in a sense, doing with a rhinoceros body what a giraffe does with its neck, feeding in a private layer of the forest, a shelf of green stocked for one guest. The size that makes it so astonishing to us was, for the animal, simply the way it made its living. To be that tall was to eat where nothing else could eat. And it lived that way for a long time, spread across an enormous territory. Fossils turn up across a broad sweep of Asia, which tells you this was not a single freak of one valley, but a successful, wide-ranging kind of animal, moving through the woodlands of an entire continent for millions of years. When you imagine it, do not imagine something rare and doomed. Imagine something common and calm, a familiar giant of its own age, feeding at dawn in the high leaves while the smaller animals moved below. For a very long time, this was where the story rested. Paraceratherium held the title without a serious challenger, the traditional and undisputed largest land mammal that ever lived. But titles in paleontology are rarely as settled as they look, and there is a second animal that must stand beside it now, a rival from a much later chapter of the Earth, and a genuinely contested one. That animal is Palaeoloxodon namadicus. Where Paraceratherium belonged to a warm, grass-free world tens of millions of years old, Palaeoloxodon namadicus belonged to a far more recent age, the Pleistocene, the long span of the ice ages that reaches from a few million years ago up to a time so recent it brushes against the edge of the world we would recognize. Its home was South Asia, the monsoon-fed river floodplains and open woodlands of the Indian subcontinent, under a climate that swung back and forth between wetter and drier phases as the great glacial cycles turned far to the north. And this animal was, unmistakably, an elephant. Not a distant rhino cousin reshaped into something odd, but a true member of the elephant family, a straight-tusked elephant, one of a group of enormous proboscideans that once ranged across the warmer parts of the Old World. Its tusks, as the name suggests, were long and comparatively straight, and its body was built on the familiar elephant plan you already carry in your mind, the pillar legs, the great fanned ears likely, the reaching trunk. Only vastly larger than any elephant now living. The estimates put its shoulder height at roughly 16 to 17 feet, in the same towering range as Paraceratherium, and its mass, by one calculation, at around 22 tons. 22 tons would edge past the 20-ton rhino relative. If that figure is right, then the crown for largest land mammal ever does not belong to Paraceratherium at all. It belongs to this Ice Age elephant, and the whole familiar ranking quietly turns over. But you must hold that word carefully. If. Because here the science asks for real honesty, and it would be a disservice to give you the tidy version. That estimate of 22 tons rests on very little. It comes largely from a single fragmentary thigh bone, one incomplete femur, scaled up using the proportions of better-known relatives. The researcher who produced the figure, Larramendi again in that same 2016 study, flagged it plainly as highly speculative for exactly this reason. When almost the entire animal is missing, and you are reconstructing tons of living flesh from a broken piece of a single leg, the honest thing to say is that the number is a careful guess, not a measurement. So the true situation is this. You have two contenders for the greatest land mammal of all time. One, Paraceratherium, is known from far more material and sits steadily near 20 tons. The other, Palaeoloxodon namadicus, might have exceeded it, reaching perhaps 22, but on evidence so thin that no careful scientist will bang the table for it. And there is even a third name that drifts through the same debate, a relative of the mastodons called Mammoth borsoni, whose own giant limb bones hint that it too may have belonged in this heavyweight company. The ranking among these three genuinely differs from one published study to the next. This is not a settled podium with a clear gold, silver and bronze. It is a contest fought across incomplete skeletons, and the title of largest land mammal ever is, in truth, still open. There is something quietly restful in admitting that. You are not being handed a false certainty to swallow. You are being shown the edge of what is known, the place where the bones run out and the careful estimates begin, and you are being trusted to hold two possibilities at once without needing one of them crushed. The largest land mammal that ever lived was either a hornless giant rhino cousin from a world without grass, or a colossal straight-tusked elephant from the age of ice. And depending on how you weigh a thigh bone, the answer changes. Let both of them stand in the dark together for a moment, enormous and patient, and simply exist. If you're drifting easily now, following these slow giants through their vanished woodlands, let me say one quiet thing before we walk on, and then I will not interrupt the calm again. If this is the kind of journey you would like to take again on another night, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. That is all. Settle back in. The giants are waiting, and there is a long way still to go. Come back now to the two mammals, because there is more to feel in them before we leave the age of mammals behind. It is worth sitting with just how large 20-some tons truly is, in a body you could have stood beside, in a world with weather and light and dust. Return to Paraceratherium first in its Oligocene woodland. Stand again at its knee. Everything about the animal is built to carry weight without collapsing under it. The leg bones are thick, straight columns, held more or less vertical beneath the body, the way the legs of an elephant are held, because at this scale there is no other way to stand. The legs splayed out to the side would snap. So the mass is stacked directly over the feet, and the feet spread wide to press that weight into the soil. When such an animal walked, it did not trot or bound. It moved at a deliberate, unhurried pace, one heavy foot swinging forward and settling, then the next, a slow rhythm you could have counted, each footfall pressing a broad print into the dry ground. Feel the scale of the head, 16 feet or more above the woodland floor, moving among the upper branches. To feed there all day, the animal needed to process an enormous volume of leaves, because leaves are poor, bulky food, and a 20-ton body is a furnace that must be fed. So imagine most of its day given over simply to eating, reaching, stripping, chewing, swallowing, moving a few steps to the next tree, reaching again. Not a hunter, not a fighter, but a vast, calm engine of digestion, quietly converting the crowns of Oligocene trees into the largest mammal the land has ever carried. There would have been no roar to it, no drama. The loudest sounds it made were probably the crack of a branch giving way, the rustle and tear of foliage, the deep, slow breathing of a great body at rest in the warmth. Around its legs, smaller creatures moved through the undergrowth, the early relatives of horses and other browsing mammals, and none of them could reach where it fed. It shared the woodland without competing for its highest shelf. That is what being the largest brought it. Not safety exactly, but solitude at the top of the trees, a private supper served far above the heads of everything else alive. Now hold Palaeoloxodon namadicus in the same patient way, in its later and wetter world. Here the season turns on the monsoon, on rains that swell the rivers and flood the low ground, then retreat and leave the woodlands to dry. A herd of these straight-tusked elephants moving across a floodplain would have been one of the greatest gatherings of living weight the land has ever known. Each adult a tower of muscle 16 or 17 feet at the shoulder, tusks running long and straight ahead of the face, trunks reaching down to the water or up into the branches. And because this was a true elephant, you can imagine its life with a little more confidence than you can the rhino cousins, because you have living elephants to guide you. Elephants are slow breeders and long livers, deeply social, patient, intelligent. Scale that life up to 22 tons and set it under an ice age sky, and you have an animal that must have moved through its world with the same unhurried gravity, feeding for most of the day, drinking deeply, the great feet pressing into the wet floodplain mud and lifting free with a soft, heavy sound. You must be careful here too, of course, and I will not pretend to more than the bones allow. We do not have this animal whole. We do not know the exact reach of its tusks or the true breadth of its body, because so little of it has been recovered. What we have is enough to say it was gigantic and not much more. The picture your mind fills in, the herd on the floodplain, the raised trunks, is honest only as long as you remember it is built around a fragment. The elephant was real. Its precise dimensions are a reconstruction, offered gently, held loosely. And that caution is the thread that ties these two mammals together, more than their size does. Both of them sit at the very limit of what the fossil record can tell us cleanly. Both of them force the same admission, that to weigh a creature that has been dead for millions of years, from bones that are broken and few, is to do careful, disciplined guesswork, not to read a figure off a scale. The 20 tons of Paraceratherium and the speculative 22 of Palaeoloxodon namadicus are the best that honest science can offer, and they come wrapped in error bars, in maybes, in the quiet phrase depending on how you measure, which is exactly why they belong at the beginning of this journey. They are the giants of the age of mammals, the largest that warm-blooded, milk-feeding, live-bearing life has ever managed to build on dry land. And they are enormous. A single one of them would tower over every elephant, every rhino, every bison and moose and bear that walks the earth today. If you gathered the biggest land mammals now living into one place, not one of them would reach the elbow of the animals we have just stood beside. And yet, here is the strange and humbling turn, the one that reshapes the whole scale of what is coming. As large as these mammals are, as far as they tower above anything alive now, they are the smallest giants on our list. 20 tons, 22 tons, 16 to 18 feet at the shoulder. These are the entry numbers. These are the animals that only just qualify to stand at the door of the truly colossal. Because the mammals, for all their bulk, were working against a set of limits that another kind of animal, long before them, had somehow slipped past. A mammal's body plan, its dense bones, its way of breathing, its way of carrying weight, seems to run into a ceiling somewhere around 20 tons on land. Push much past that, and the design begins to fail. Paraceratherium and Palaeoloxodon namadicus are, in a sense, the mammal body plan pressed right up against that ceiling, straining at the very top of what warm-blooded land life can do. So take one last look at them before the light in their world dims. The hornless giant in its Oligocene woodland, feeding in the high leaves of a world without grass. The straight-tusked elephant on its ice age floodplain, moving with the monsoon through the last few 100,000 years. Hold their weight in your mind, 20 tons and more, standing quietly in the dark, the largest that mammals ever grew. And then let that scene fade back. the way a slow camera drifts away from a sleeping herd, the trees closing over them, the warm air going still. Because for all their size, they mark only the threshold. The true colossi, the animals that make 20 tons look modest, were never mammals at all. They belonged to a far older lineage, and they had already come and gone tens of millions of years before the first Paraceratherium ever lifted its head into an Oligocene tree. Picture the ground under your feet first, because it is nothing like the ground you know. There is no grass here, not one blade, not anywhere on the whole planet. Grass will not spread across the world for another 80 million years and more. So the floor of this place is older and stranger than any lawn. It is a low, soft tangle of ferns and horsetails, threading green between the trees. The horsetails grow in dense stands along every wet edge, hollow and jointed, ribbed like little green bottle brushes, some no taller than your knee. You wade in among them, and the fern fronds brush your shins as you go, cool and feathery, leaving a faint damp streak across your skin. This is the Morrison Formation, roughly 150 million years ago, deep in the late Jurassic. The rock that holds it now lies under Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Oklahoma. Back then it was a vast, low floodplain, tilted so gently toward the sea that the rivers could never settle on one path. They split and rejoined across the plain in shallow braided channels, sandy and wandering, looping around long bars of gravel and pale driftwood. In the wet months the water runs the colour of weak tea, warm over your ankles, so slow it barely seems to move at all. Between the channels stand the groves, conifers mostly tall and resinous, their trunks straight and bare for the first 30 or 40 feet before the branches begin. The air beneath them is heavy with the smell of sap and warm needles. Lower down grow tree ferns, their trunks like shaggy poles, their crowns of fronds spread wide as parasols. Cycads squat closer to the ground, stiff and palm-like, their cones sitting heavy in the crowns, and here and there a ginkgo lifts its leaves, each one shaped like a small green fan, the very same fan shape a ginkgo leaf still carries today. That tree has barely changed in all the time between. Standing among them, you are looking at one of the few living things from this world you might actually recognize. For much of the year the air is warm and dry. This is a seasonal land, not a rainforest. For long stretches the sky holds no cloud and the plain bakes under a hard, high sun. The rivers shrink back into their beds. The mud along the banks dries pale, curls at the edges, and cracks into a mosaic of plates you could lift like broken pottery. Dust rises off the flats on the afternoon wind and drifts over everything, warm and fine, powdering the ferns a soft grey and settling on your forearms as lightly as sifted ash. In some years, far out toward the horizon, you catch the smell of smoke. Wildfire is moving through the tinder-dry undergrowth, and for days afterward the light turns bronze, and the sun hangs low and red and flat, and ash floats down through the still air like slow snow. Then the season turns. The monsoon rains arrive, and the shrunken rivers swell and climb their banks and spill. Water spreads in a thin, bright sheet across the whole plain, filling every hollow, leaving shallow lakes and quiet ponds that will stand for months. The dust becomes mud again. The cracked flats vanish under warm, still water, and the fern beds green almost overnight, unrolling new fronds by the thousand. This slow pulse, dry then wet, wet then dry, repeated across the plain year upon year, is a large part of why so many bones survive to be found. Animals crowded to the last shrinking water in the drought. The floods that followed rolled sediment over whatever the dry months had killed, sealing them in sand and silt before they could weather away. Now stand still in the middle of it and listen. There is remarkably little sound. No birdsong as you would know it, no chorus in the trees. Insects hum somewhere over the water. Wind moves through the fern beds with a dry, papery hiss. A river slides over gravel close by. And then, beneath all of it, comes something you feel before you hear it. a low-spaced thud carried up through the soles of your feet and through the wet ground itself, like a far door closing deep underground. A footfall. Somewhere out among the groves, an animal heavy enough to shake the whole plain is walking, one slow and deliberate step at a time. This was the world of the first true giants. The Morrison held a whole community of sauropods, the long-necked, small-headed, pillar-legged plant-eaters that grew larger than any land animal before them, and arguably larger than any since. Among them walked Brachiosaurus altithorax, first described in 1903 by Elmer Riggs, from bones lifted out of the Colorado rock. Brachiosaurus was built unlike most of its neighbours. Its front legs were longer than its back legs, so its shoulders rose high, and its neck climbed from them at a steep angle, giving it a sloping, giraffe-like line. It could hold its head perhaps 30 feet off the ground and strip the crowns of conifers that nothing else could reach. From nose to tail it ran about 85 feet. Weighing such an animal is far harder than measuring it, and honest researchers disagree openly. The very same Brachiosaurus skeleton has been modelled at anywhere from around 30 tons to more than 60, depending only on how much soft flesh you choose to drape over the same bones. That is the plain state of the science. You cannot set an extinct animal on a scale, so you estimate the muscle and gut around what is left, and careful people reach very different answers. Sharing this floodplain was a longer creature still. Supersaurus viviani, a diplodocid, was built almost the reverse of Brachiosaurus. Low at the shoulder, with a whip-thin tail and a neck carried out ahead of it like a long horizontal boom. Its best skeleton, nicknamed Jimbo, stands mounted at about 106 feet. An ongoing study of its unusually long neck, tail, and shoulder blades suggests it may have reached further still, toward 130 feet or more. If those higher figures hold, Supersaurus is a leading candidate for the longest dinosaur ever found. A study of the microscopic structure of Jimbo's bones found the animal had reached full skeletal maturity, which means this already enormous individual was close to as large as its kind ever grew, not a youngster with growing left to do, nearly the ceiling of the species. Try to hold the scale of these animals against the small, warm world around them. A single thigh bone could stand taller than you do. Their necks swept slowly through the conifer crowns, breaking off needles by the branchful, and their feet, broad and round as the top of a barrel, pressed deep craters into the wet mud that the next flood would fill and keep. Whether they held those long necks high, the way the giraffe they are so often drawn as would, or swung them low and level across the ground, is still genuinely argued over. Modelling the blood pressure needed to push blood up to a fully raised head returns numbers so extreme that many researchers now doubt any heart could safely sustain them, and lean instead toward the low, sweeping posture, the neck moving like the boom of a crane. It is not settled. It is one of the real open questions about how these bodies actually worked. Whatever the truth of the neck, the pace was unhurried. These were not fast animals and not aggressive ones. They were slow mountains of muscle and gut, spending nearly all the daylight simply feeding, turning whole thickets of fern and stands of conifer into flesh, one patient ton after another. A herd of them drifting across the plain would have looked less like a stampede and more like weather itself, a slow dark front of shapes moving between the groves, trailing a low haze of that warm floodplain dust behind them as they went. And all of it, the braided rivers and the cracked flats, the fern floor and the fanned ginkgo leaves and the resin-heavy shade, existed 150 million years before the first heavy mammal ever set down a foot. The great hornless browsers of a much later, cooler, drier world were not even a possibility yet. The mammals sharing this Jurassic were small, quiet, wary things down in the undergrowth, few of them larger than a house cat, keeping to the leaf litter and the shadows beneath the giants that ruled the light above them. To find anything larger, you have to leave the age of mammals behind and walk back into the long afternoon of the Jurassic. To find anything larger, you have to leave the age of mammals behind and walk back into the long afternoon of the Jurassic. Set the clock to roughly 150 million years ago. Stand in the middle of a wide North American floodplain, on the ground that geologists now call the Morrison Formation. The heat here is dry and patient. Braided rivers thread across the plain in shallow shifting channels, splitting and rejoining around low banks of sand. Groves of conifers rise in dark green columns. Between them grow tree ferns, squat cycads, and the fan-leaved ginkgos. Look down at your feet. There is no grass anywhere. Grass does not exist yet. Not on this plain, not anywhere on Earth. So the ground is not a lawn. It is a low tangle of ferns and horsetails, the horsetails standing in jointed green stems along the damp river margins. In the dry months, dust hangs in the air, and in some years the smell of wildfire smoke drifts across the flats. Then the monsoon rains come and leave shallow lakes standing on the mud. This is the world that grew the first true giants of dry land. Into that world moves something the size of a leaning building. This is Brachiosaurus altithorax. You would know it first by its shape, because it is built wrong for a dinosaur, or at least wrong for what you expect. Most large sauropods carried their front end low. This one does the opposite. Its forelimbs are longer than its hind limbs, so the shoulders ride high and the back slopes down toward the tail. The whole animal is tilted upward at the front like a living ramp. That single feature changes everything about how it feeds. With its neck lifted from those tall shoulders, Brachiosaurus could browse leaves up to roughly 30 feet off the ground. Picture the top of a 3-story building. Now picture a mouth cropping foliage at that height, unhurried, working through the crown of a conifer that shorter giants could never reach. It was not competing for the low ferns. It fed in a layer of the forest that almost nothing else could touch. The animal was first described in 1903 by a paleontologist named Elmer Riggs, working for what was then the Field Columbian Museum in Chicago. The name he gave it, altithorax, means deep chest, and it fits. The rib cage was enormous, a barrel of bone built to hold a vast gut and a set of air sacs we will come back to. From nose to tail tip, a full-grown Brachiosaurus altithorax stretched about 85 feet. That is longer than a stack of 5 family cars parked bumper to bumper, all of it one slow, breathing creature. Now comes the strange part, the part that keeps paleontologists arguing in a calm and careful way. How much did it weigh? And the honest answer is that nobody can tell you a single number. Across the serious studies, the mass estimates for Brachiosaurus altithorax spread from about 32 US tons at the low end to roughly 62 US tons at the high end. That is not a small disagreement. The heaviest estimate is nearly double the lightest, and here is what should make you pause as you drift. These estimates come from the same skeleton, the same bones, the same animal. So why does one set of bones yield 2 very different weights? To understand that, you have to understand what a paleontologist is actually doing when they weigh a creature that has been dead for 150 million years. They cannot put it on a scale. The scale rusted into non-existence before the first mammal grew large. What they have is the frame, and the frame is only part of the story. Think of the skeleton as scaffolding. Around that scaffolding in life there was muscle, fat, skin, organs, and air. All the soft tissue that gave the animal its true shape and volume. None of that fossilizes in a way that lets you measure it directly. So the researcher has to decide from the bones alone how much flesh to hang on the frame. How thick were the muscles over the hips? How deep was the chest below the ribs? How much of the neck was solid tissue and how much was air? Each of those choices is a judgment, and small differences in judgment multiplied across a body 85 feet long, add up to tons. One method wraps the skeleton in a lean, minimal envelope of tissue, hugging the bone closely and arrives at a lighter animal. Another method models a fuller, more heavily muscled body with deeper contours and arrives at a heavier one. Neither is being careless. They are making defensible assumptions from incomplete evidence, and the assumptions diverge. That gap, from 32 to 62 US tons, is not a failure of the science. It is the science being honest about what a handful of bones can and cannot tell you. When you hear a single confident wait for a giant dinosaur, remember the range hiding behind it. Let the Brachiosaurus move off through the conifers, its high shoulders swaying, its footfalls landing in the soft floodplain mud. Let the Jurassic afternoon lengthen, and then let it pass entirely. We are going to walk forward now about 40 million years, out of the Jurassic and into the early Cretaceous. The rivers still run, the conifers still stand, and still, remarkably, there is no grass. The ground layer is the same patient carpet of ferns and horsetails, spreading low between the tree trunks while the giants feed far above it. The place is what is now southeastern Oklahoma, and the time is about 110 million years ago. And here we meet an animal known from almost nothing at all. 4 bones. That is the entire physical record of one of the most astonishing creatures that ever lived. 4 enormous vertebrae from the neck, pulled from the Oklahoma rock in 1994. No skull, no legs, no feet, no tail, just 4 pieces of a neck, and yet those 4 pieces were enough to rewrite the ceiling of the dinosaur world. The animal was named Sauroposeidon proteles. The first part honours Poseidon, the old god of earthquakes, because a creature this size would have shaken the ground as it walked. And what the 4 vertebrae revealed was a neck of almost unbelievable length. When the researchers laid them out and compared them to the necks of better-known relatives, they realized they were looking at the longest neck of any animal yet discovered. Each single vertebra was longer than a grown person is tall. Do the reconstruction slowly. If Sauroposeidon raised that neck to something near its full extent, it could lift its head roughly 60 feet off the ground. 60 feet. That is the tallest reach documented for any dinosaur, anywhere, in the entire fossil record. Nothing else we have found could put its mouth higher into the air. Try to feel that height with your body, not just your mind. Imagine standing at the base of a building and looking up to a window on the 3rd floor, then the 4th, then the 5th, and higher still. The head of this animal would have hovered up there, above the 5th floor, browsing in a layer of the forest that belonged to it alone. A person standing beneath its chest would not have reached the bottom of its rib cage. You would have stood in its shadow the way you stand in the shadow of a wall. From the 4 neck bones and their proportions, the full body of Sauroposeidon has been scaled to a length of up to about 112 feet, with a mass estimated somewhere around 55 to 66 US tons. Hold those numbers gently, because they are built from 4 bones and a great deal of careful comparison, not from a complete skeleton. But even at the cautious end, this was a colossal animal, and its signature was not bulk. It was reach. It was the ability to feed at a height nothing else could share. If you are finding this walk through deep time restful, and you would like more nights like this one, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It costs you nothing, and it keeps the long, slow journeys coming. Now settle back in, and let us stay a while longer with these impossible necks, because there is a puzzle inside them worth turning over quietly. The puzzle is simple to state. How could any animal lift its head 60 feet into the air? Not how did the bone support it? How did the blood get up there? Your own heart works constantly to push blood a few feet upward to your brain when you stand. Now raise that brain to the height of a 5-story building and ask what the heart below would have to do to keep it supplied. Researchers have actually modelled this. To drive blood all the way up a fully vertical sauropod neck to a head held 60 feet high, the heart would need to generate a blood pressure of something like 700 millimeters of mercury. That is far beyond what any known cardiovascular system, living or extinct, appears able to sustain. It is a pressure that seems to break the animal from the inside, and that number is one of the main reasons many researchers now suspect these giants did not, as a rule, hold their necks straight up like a grazing giraffe. Instead, the leading idea is that a neck like this spent most of its time held closer to horizontal. Picture the long boom of a crane, swung out low and level over the plain, sweeping in a wide arc. The animal plants its huge feet, stays still, and lets the neck do the walking. It clears one great semicircle of foliage without taking a step, then shifts its weight, plants again, and sweeps another arc. Feeding by reach rather than by travel. For a body that heavy, moving less and reaching more was simply good economy. Now be careful here, because this is a live scientific debate and not a settled fact. Whether the giant sauropods habitually raised their necks near vertical, or held them mostly horizontal, is still argued among the people who study their bones and their biology. The cardiovascular modelling leans toward the horizontal posture, but it is modelling, built on assumptions about hearts and vessels we can never dissect. Some researchers still favour a more upright browse for at least part of the time. The truth is that we are reconstructing the plumbing of an animal that vanished long before there was anyone to watch it drink. So we hold the picture loosely, and we say plainly where the uncertainty lives. There is one more piece to the puzzle of these necks, and it is the reason they could exist at all. A neck 60 feet long, built of solid bone and dense muscle, would be far too heavy for any animal to lift, so it was not solid. The vertebrae of Sauroposeidon and its kin were riddled with air. Hollow chambers and pockets ran all through them, connected to a bird-like system of air sacs that reached deep into the skeleton. On average, a sauropod neck vertebra was something like 60% air by volume. Sit with that for a moment as you rest. The very bones that held these animals up were more air than mineral. Where you might imagine a heavy shaft of bone, there was instead a delicate lattice. Thin walls of bone-bracing pockets of empty space, strung along the lines of stress and hollow everywhere else. This is the same trick that lets a bird be light enough to fly, carried into the skeleton of a creature that could never leave the ground. And it is why a sauropod could grow a neck roughly 2/3 longer than an older, denser-boned ancestor could have managed for the same skeletal weight. The lightness in the bones brought the length in the neck. Reach was built out of emptiness. So when you imagine Sauroposeidon lifting its head toward that 5th-floor window, do not imagine a heavy pillar of bone straining upward. Imagine something closer to a scaffold of struts and air, immense and yet, for its size, astonishingly light. The animal was enormous by mass and delicate by design, both at once, and there is no contradiction in that. It is simply how you build a giant that has to hold its own head against the pull of the earth. Step back now and let both of these animals stand together in your mind for a moment, across the 40 million years that separate them. The late Jurassic Brachiosaurus, high-shouldered over the Morrison rivers, weighed on scales no living person will ever read, its true mass hidden inside the guesswork of soft tissue. And the early Cretaceous Sauroposeidon, known from 4 bones and famous for a reach nothing else could match, feeding above a floor of ferns and horsetails in the Oklahoma warmth. 2 different worlds, 2 different body plans, joined by the same slow experiment. How high can a mouth be raised? How long can a neck be built? How large can a walking body become before the rules of blood and bone say no further? These northern giants were the answer that the Jurassic and the early Cretaceous gave to that question. And they were a very good answer. For their time, on their continents, nothing on land stood taller or reached higher. But they were not the final word. The experiment was still running, and it was running hardest not here in the north, but far away, on a landmass drifting through warmer southern seas. Let the Oklahoma forest go quiet. Let the great level neck of Sauroposeidon sweep one last slow arc through the treetops and settle. Let the shallow rivers keep braiding across the plain, unwatched, as the early Cretaceous turns slowly toward its own long afternoon. We have seen how tall a dinosaur could stand and how high it could reach. Now the story of size moves, and it moves in a direction, toward the equator and beyond it, into the south. Carry your attention down the length of the ancient Americas, cross the warm, shallow seas that divided the continents in that age. Come to rest on the wide floodplains and interdune ponds of what will one day be called Patagonia, at the far southern end of South America. The light is warm here. The rivers are seasonal. Early flowering plants are beginning to spread among the older conifers and the ferns, and now and then volcanic ash drifts down from young mountains and settles over everything, burying bone and egg alike so gently that they will keep for tens of millions of years. The ground in Chubut province holds its secrets close. It is dry, wind-scoured Patagonian scrub, the kind of open country where a bone can lie half exposed for a season before anyone passes near enough to notice. In 2012, on a sheep ranch called La Flecha, a worker did notice. Something dark had weathered out of a low hillside, and it was clearly not a rock. It was the end of a thigh bone, and the shape of it kept going into the earth far past where a normal fossil would stop. That single femur set the whole thing in motion. Word reached paleontologists at the Egidio Ferruglio Museum in Trelew, and a team came out to look. What they began to uncover was a thigh bone so long that two people could lie down head to foot along its length and still not span it end to end. You could stand it upright and it would rise past your head like a fence post cut from stone. Bones on that scale do not come out of the ground quickly. It took days simply to free this one, working the sediment back inch by patient inch, wrapping the exposed surfaces in burlap and plaster so the fossil would not crack apart the moment it lost the support of the earth around it. This is how a giant becomes a name. Not in a flash of recognition, but slowly through seasons of careful digging, through the dull ache of kneeling in cold wind and brushing grit away from something that has waited more than 90 million years for the light. The team dug through 2012 and into 2013, and the hillside kept giving. That is the part that turned a good find into an extraordinary one. This was not one animal that had died alone. As the quarry opened, the diggers realized the bones belonged to at least 6 separate individuals, their remains layered and mingled together in the same bed of ancient floodplain mud. 6 of the largest land animals ever known, gathered in a single place at a single moment of geologic time. No one is certain why. The favoured reading is that a river floodplain in the Cretaceous drew these creatures back again and again, perhaps in hard seasons, and that some of them died there and were buried where they fell. Whatever the reason, the effect for science was a gift. Where most titanosaurs are known from a handful of bones, here was a bed rich enough to reconstruct much of a skeleton from overlapping parts, one animal filling in what another was missing. In 2017, that animal received its formal name. Patagotitan majorum, published by José Luis Carballido and colleagues in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. The first estimates were staggering even by the standards of giants, a length near 121 feet and a mass around 76 US tons. Yet here the detective work took its most honest turn, as researchers applied more conservative methods for reconstructing the volume of a body from its bones. Those numbers came down. Later analyses put the length closer to 102 feet, and the mass in a more modest range, bringing Patagotitan into line with its relatives rather than towering absurdly above them. The animal did not shrink. Only our confidence in the first bold guess did, which is exactly how the work is supposed to go. You can feel, in a find like that, how much patience the science demands. A bone is not an animal. A bone is a clue, and the animal has to be built back around it with argument and comparison, and a willingness to be corrected. Nowhere is that clearer than a few hundred miles farther south in Santa Cruz province, where a different team was spending 4 long field seasons chasing a different giant across the same wind-hammered country. That giant became Dreadnoughtus shrani, and the man who led its excavation was the paleontologist Kenneth Lacavara. 4 field seasons is not a figure of speech. It means 4 separate campaigns, 4 times packing in and setting up and digging until the weather or the calendar drove the team out, then returning to take up the work again. Season by season, the skeleton emerged from rock laid down roughly 77 million years ago. And what emerged was, by one crucial measure, the finest giant ever pulled from the ground. When Lacovara and his colleagues described the animal in 2014, they could report that it was more than 70% complete counting by individual bones, leaving aside the skull. For a titanosaur, an animal group usually known from scraps, that completeness is almost unheard of. Most of the true colossi are ghosts assembled from a vertebra here, an arm bone there. Dreadnoughtus was very nearly a whole creature, roughly 85 feet of it, lying in the Patagonian dirt waiting to be read. And yet even the best skeleton ever found could not settle the simplest question anyone wanted to ask. How much did it weigh? The original description put the mass near 65 US tons, calculated from the circumference of the limb bones, the shafts that had to bear the animal's weight in life. Then, in 2015, a separate group led by Carl Bates rebuilt the body as a three-dimensional volume and arrived at a figure closer to 30 to 40 tons, roughly half the first number. The disagreement has never fully resolved. Two careful methods, one exceptional skeleton, and answers that differ by nearly a factor of 2. It is a plain reminder that weighing an animal which no longer exists is an act of reasoned estimation, not measurement, no matter how many of its bones you hold in your hands. If you've been listening and finding some quiet in this slow walk through deep time, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these long nights coming. There is one more Patagonian discovery worth standing inside because it answers a question the bones of the adults never could. How did animals this enormous begin? In 1997, a team working in Rio Negro province came onto a hillside scattered with fossil eggs. Not a clutch or two, but layer upon layer of them, whole horizons of nests stacked through the sediment, spreading across the ground for miles. They called the site Auca Mahuevo, and it remains the richest window ever found into how the giants of the land brought forth their young. The eggs were roughly the size of a large grapefruit, modest cradles for animals that would one day weigh as much as 10 elephants. Within some of them, astonishingly, lay the remains of embryos that had never hatched, and with the embryos came something rarer still, patches of fossilized skin, the fine pebbled texture of a titanosaur's hide pressed into stone before the creature ever drew breath, described by Luis Chiappe, Rodolfo Coria, and their colleagues in the journal Nature in 1998. To stand at that site is to understand that a 100-foot animal starts smaller than your two cupped hands, curled inside a shell, its skin already patterned for the world it would never quite reach. Think of what these three finds share, spread across the map of southern Argentina. A femur too long to lie beside, a skeleton pieced from 4 years of returning to the same quarry, a nursery stretching over the horizon. Each began as something faint, a dark shape in a hillside, a rumour carried to a museum, a scatter of stone spheres a casual eye would have walked straight past, and each became knowledge only through the unglamorous labour of freeing the bone, wrapping it, hauling it out, cleaning it grain by grain, and then arguing carefully over what it could and could not tell you. That is the quiet truth beneath every enormous number you will hear tonight. Behind the tonnages and the lengths stand people on their knees in the wind, and behind them stand the animals themselves, which never knew they were record holders. They were simply alive, moving at an unhurried walk across floodplains threaded with early flowering plants and old conifer forests, their footfalls landing soft in wet mud, ash from distant volcanoes drifting down to bury and preserve whatever it settled over. The bones we now measure so anxiously were once just the frame of a living body, growing, straining against its own weight, testing without knowing it the outer limits of what flesh on land could support. And Patagonia was where much of that testing happened. The far south of the Cretaceous world was a nursery not only for eggs but for size itself, a place where lineage after lineage of titanosaurs pushed the frame of the sauropod body outward, generation by generation, toward masses no land animal had reached before or has reached since. The oldest of these experiments run deep into the period, long before the giants of La Flecha and Santa Cruz walked their floodplains. To follow how bodies grew this large, you have to travel back to where the pushing began. Far to the south, in a warmer and younger world, the titanosaurs were only beginning to test how large a living body could become. Far to the south, in a warmer and younger world, the titanosaurs were only beginning to test how large a living body could become. Picture the place first, before any single animal. You are standing on a broad river floodplain in what is now Patagonia, roughly 87 million years back. The air is warm and seasonal, wet in some months and dry in others. Braided channels wander across the flats, and shallow ponds sit in the hollows between low dunes. There is no grass anywhere. Instead, the ground is a low green weave of ferns and horsetails, and above it stand conifers and podocarps, dark and resinous in the heat. Something new is spreading through this world, quietly. The first flowering plants are creeping in along the water margins, small and unremarkable, sharing the light with far older lineages. Now and then a fine grey ash drifts down from volcanoes rising to the west, the young ancestors of the Andes. That ash is part of why you can hear this story at all. It buried bones and eggs quickly, sealing them from decay, and it is the reason Patagonia has become the richest hunting ground on Earth for the largest animals that ever walked. Into this landscape walk the giants. Not quickly. These were slow, deliberate herbivores, the kind of animal that spends most of its waking hours simply eating. A single footfall drove a foot the size of a trash can lid into the wet mud, and the impact would have carried more as a low thud felt through the ground than as a sound you heard. You might feel these animals before you saw them, a soft tremor rising through the soles of your feet, the way a heavy door closing in another room moves the floor beneath you. The first of them we can name well was found beside a lake. In March of the year 2000, a team working the shore of Lake Barriales in Neuquén province began to uncover bones in the rocks of the Puertasaurus formation. What they lifted out over the following seasons became Futalognkosaurus duquet, and it turned out to be one of the most complete giant titanosaurs ever recovered. That completeness is the rare and precious thing here. Most of these colossal animals are known from scraps, a vertebra here, a shattered limb there. Futalognkosaurus came out of the ground across 3 individuals that together preserved something close to 70% of the skeleton. 70% does not sound like much until you remember what the alternative usually is. For most sauropod giants, the estimate rests on a handful of bones, and the rest of the animal is reasoned outward from close relatives. With Futalognkosaurus, the reasoning had far less empty space to cross. You could see the shape of the neck, the run of the back, the great width of the hips, all of it anchored in a real fossil rather than inference. It is the difference between describing a house from its doorknob and describing it after walking through most of its rooms. The neck was the first thing that told you how strange this animal was. It carried 14 vertebrae, and in places it stood more than 3 feet deep from top to bottom. A column of bone taller than a large dog is long. Along the top of that neck ran tall neural spines shaped like the fins of a shark, rising in a ridge above the vertebrae. Those spines were anchor points, the places where powerful muscles and ligaments grip to hold the long neck aloft and swing it slowly from side to side. To see them cleaned and laid in a row is to understand that the neck was not a simple pole. It was a suspension system, engineered in bone. Then there were the hips. The ilia, the broad blades of the pelvis that sit over the hind legs, reached about 8.5 feet wide across the animal. Sit with that figure a moment as you lie there. A single pair of hip bones, side by side, spanning wider than a grown adult is tall. That width tells you the rib cage in front of it was vast, a barrel of a body built to hold an enormous gut. And it hints at the tactile fact worth carrying with you into sleep. A hip bone from this animal was broad enough that you could lie across it the way you lie across a bed, your whole length resting on the span of a single bone. When Futalognkosaurus was first announced, the numbers ran higher than they do today. Early estimates put its length at something like 105 to 112 feet. As the study deepened and the methods grew more careful, that figure came down. The length paleontologists now favour sits closer to 85 to 92 feet. This is not a failure of science. It is science doing exactly what it should, tightening its grip on a number as more of the animal is understood. A giant that shrinks from a first excited guess to a firmer, smaller truth is still a giant. It is simply a better measured one. You should know that this pattern repeats again and again with these animals, and it is worth making peace with it before we go further. The very first number is almost always the largest. It is offered when the least is known, when the animal is most exciting and least understood. Then the corrections come, slow and unglamorous, and the record settles into something more honest. When you hear that a dinosaur was reclassified as smaller than first claimed, you are not hearing a giant diminished. You are hearing knowledge arrive. Move now from the lakeshore northward and a little later in time to Mendoza Province. Here, in Upper Cretaceous rock, another titanosaur was pulled from the ground and described in the year 2016. Its name is Notocolossus gonzalez pariasi, and it is known from far less material than Futalognkosaurus. But one of its bones stopped everyone who looked at it. The humerus, the upper arm bone that runs from shoulder to elbow, measured 5 feet 9 inches long. Stand that beside yourself in the dark. This single arm bone was as tall as a tall man, and at its upper end it flared out more than 2 feet wide. At the time it was described, that was the longest and widest titanosaur humerus known to science. Think about what a bone like that has to do. It is a pillar carrying the front of a body that may have weighed as much as 10 elephants, absorbing the shock of every slow step, holding firm as the animal shifted its weight from one side to the other while it fed. Bone this thick is not decorative. Every inch of its width is a reply to gravity, a structural answer to the simple and brutal problem of holding an enormous mass off the ground for a lifetime. From that arm bone and the fragments found with it, Notocolossus was estimated at somewhere over 82 feet long, and perhaps, at the upper edge of the guesses, closer to 100. Its mass has been placed in the range of 45 to 60 tons. Notice the width of that range. It is honest. With so little of the skeleton in hand, no one can be more precise, and the good scientists do not pretend to be. The bone is real and enormous. The animal built around it is a careful, bounded estimate, and it is offered as exactly that. I want to slow here and let you feel where you are, because the temptation with these animals is to race from record to record, and that is the opposite of what this hour is for. You are standing on a warm floodplain under a hazy sky. The largest land animals that have ever lived are moving around you at a walking pace, cropping leaves from conifers and from the ferns at their feet, their long necks sweeping in slow arcs like the booms of great cranes. There is no hurry in them. There was no hurry in this world. Whatever calls or sounds they made, and we truly do not know, no fossil records the voice of a titanosaur. The loudest thing about them may simply have been the ground itself under their feet. Now travel far to the south, to Santa Cruz Province, near the bottom of the continent, and to an animal whose name was built to impress. Over 4 field seasons, a team led by the paleontologist Kenneth Lacavara excavated a skeleton from rocks about 77 million years old. When they described it in the year 2014, they gave it a name drawn from the old armoured warships, the Dreadnoughts, Dreadnoughtus shrani, a giant that feared, the name suggests, almost nothing. What made Dreadnoughtus remarkable was not a claim of being the biggest, it was completeness. The team reported more than 70% of the skeleton recovered by bone count, leaving aside the skull, which is almost never found with these animals. That made it the most complete skeleton of any truly giant titanosaur ever unearthed. For an animal in this size class, that is extraordinary. You're used to giants being known from a thigh bone and a wish. Here was one you could very nearly walk the length of, bone by real bone. From the base of the neck to the tip of the tail, its body ran about 85 feet long, And here the tale turns into one of the most honest arguments in all of paleontology, so let me lay it out plainly, because it teaches you how these numbers are truly made. When the team first weighed Dreadnoughtus, they used a method based on the circumference of its limb bones. The thickness of the femur and the upper arm, where they are narrowest, scales in living four-legged animals with how much weight those limbs carry. Run the titanosaurs' measurements through that relationship, and the answer came out at 59 3/10 tons, roughly 65 US tons. An animal as heavy as a small herd of elephants stacked into one body. Then, in the year 2015, a separate group of researchers led by Carl Bates took a different road to the same question. Instead of scaling from bone circumference, they built the animal in 3 dimensions. They reconstructed the skeleton digitally, wrapped it in a plausible envelope of flesh, and calculated the volume of the body they had drawn. Their answer came in far lower, somewhere around 30 to 40 tons, roughly half of the first estimate. 2 careful teams, 1 animal, and a gap between their numbers that you could drive a truck through. This is not a scandal. It is the honest heart of the whole enterprise, and you deserve to hear it stated without spin. There is no titanosaur alive to step onto a scale. Every mass you will ever hear quoted for one of these animals is a model, an argument built from bones and assumptions about the soft body that once surrounded them. The limb scaling method and the volumetric method are both respectable, and they disagree. The original describer has stood by the higher figure. Others favour the lower. As of now, that dispute is simply unresolved. A live disagreement over how to weigh an animal that no longer exists. When someone tells you a dinosaur weighed exactly some number of tons, the honest reply is that we are still arguing, and the argument is a good one. If you are drifting, hold on to this. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the knowing. It is the shape of knowing something this old and this large. The bones are certain. The body is a careful, contested reconstruction, and the scientists doing the contesting are the reason we can trust the rangers at all. Around here we're near the midpoint of our long walk through deep time, so let me say one quiet thing before we go on. If this slow hour is helping you rest, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let it go and come back to the floodplain. Now for the question underneath all of these animals, the one that matters more than any single length or weight. How is any of this even possible? How does a land animal reach 80 tons and still stand, still walk, still lift a neck 30 feet into the air, when the largest land mammals ever, the hornless rhino relatives, topped out near 20 tons and could climb no higher? The answer is not in the legs, though the legs are magnificent. The answer is in the breath, and in the bones being nearly hollow. The titanosaurs, like all sauropods and like the birds that share their deeper ancestry, did not breathe the way you do. Your lungs fill and empty like a pair of bags, drawing air in and pushing the same air back out. A bird does something cleverer. It runs air one way through its lungs in a continuous flow, driven by a network of air sacs that reach out of the lungs and into the body, even into the bones themselves. The sauropods had that same system, and it left its fingerprint on their skeletons in a way you can still read in the fossils. Their vertebrae were riddled with air. Not solid bone, but bone shot through with hollow chambers and pockets, invaded by extensions of those air sacs while the animal lived. The average pneumatic vertebra in one of these giants was roughly 60% air by volume. Read that again as you lie there. More than half of the backbone by volume was empty space filled with air rather than heavy tissue. The skeleton was a scaffold of struts and thin walls, engineered like the inside of a bird's bone, strong along the lines of stress and hollow everywhere else. This is the trick that unlocked the size. A neck built of air-filled bone weighs a fraction of what a solid neck would. The lightning was so effective that a sauropod could carry a neck about 2/3 longer than a similarly built ancestor could have managed for the same weight of skeleton. The air did not just save weight, it brought reach, and reach meant food, acres of foliage a shorter animal could never touch, swept in without the animal moving its heavy body an inch. Lightness in the bones was not a side effect. It was the whole engine of becoming enormous. There is a second half to the puzzle, and it is where the science grows most careful, so we will tread carefully too. If these animals held their necks straight up, like a giraffe reaching into a tall tree, the heart faced an almost impossible task. To push blood all the way up a vertical neck to a head 30 feet in the air, against gravity, the pressure at the heart would have needed to reach as high as 700 millimeters of mercury. That is far beyond what any cardiovascular system known to biology can safely sustain. A heart working that hard, in a body this large, strains the limits of what living tissue can bear. So most researchers now lean toward a different picture of how these giants fed. Rather than rearing the neck near vertical for hours, they likely held it much closer to horizontal, sweeping it slowly across a wide arc at low and middling heights, the way a crane boom swings across a worksite without ever pointing straight up. Feed low and wide, and the heart is spared the impossible climb. This is what a body was going to need if it wanted to be this large and still keep blood moving to its brain. I want to be honest that this is not fully settled. Neck posture in the giant sauropods is still a genuine debate. Some anatomists point to the joints between the vertebrae and argue for a more raised, alert carriage of the neck at rest. The cardiovascular modelling pushes the other way, toward the horizontal. What we can say plainly is that the fully upright giraffe-style browsing of old paintings is now the least favoured option, not because it looks wrong, but because the plumbing struggles to support it. Where the truth finally lands, the neck was going to reach across a great deal of the world either way. Put the pieces together and you can almost feel the animal breathe. Air flows one way through the lungs in a steady current, cool and continuous, never stale. That air fills the sacs, and the sacs invade the bones, and the bones grow light enough to build a body no mammal could ever match. The long neck sweeps low across the ferns and the young flowering plants, gathering food by the ton without the great body needing to walk. A femur alone stands as tall as you do. A single vertebra is wider than a dinner table, and the whole assembly, 10 elephants in mass, moves at the pace of a slow afternoon walk, because nothing in this world could make it hurry. This is how the largest bodies that ever pressed down on solid ground were possible at all. Not brute strength alone, but a quiet architecture of air, a skeleton half empty on purpose, a breath borrowed from the lineage that would one day become birds. The titanosaurs were not simply big mammals scaled up. They were a different solution to the problem of being alive, one that mammals never found and never could. Let the scene widen now, slowly, the way a held breath finally releases. The floodplain stretches out around these animals, warm and hazy, dusted here and there with volcanic ash that will one day become their tomb and their preservation. Futalognkosaurus by its lake, 70% of it still waiting in the rock. Notocolossus with its arm bone as tall as a man. Dreadnoughtus, most complete of all the giants, its true weight still gently argued over by careful people who admit what they do not know. Consider the neck for a moment, that long bridge of bone reaching out from the shoulders. It is the part of a giant sauropod that seems most impossible, and it is the part paleontologists argue about most, not whether it existed, but how the animal carried it. Two pictures compete, and both are drawn by serious people looking at the same bones. The first picture is the one you likely already hold in your mind. In it, the sauropod stands like an enormous giraffe, neck lifted toward the sky, head browsing among the high crowns of conifers and ginkgos that no other animal on the floodplain could reach. It is a beautiful image, and for most of a century it shaped how these creatures were drawn and mounted in museum halls. The raised neck felt right. It matched the towering skeletons. It explained why an animal would grow a neck 30 or 40 feet long in the first place, as a ladder into the canopy. The second picture is quieter and lower to the ground. In it the neck is held mostly level, sweeping in a slow arc from side to side, closer to a crane boom than a flagpole. The head moves across a wide fan of ground and low foliage without the animal taking a single step. In this version, the great length of the neck is not a ladder at all. It is a way to stand in one place and harvest an enormous circle of plants, feeding for hours while the massive body barely shifts its weight. Two hypotheses then, the reacher and the sweeper. And the thing that increasingly tilts the argument is not a bone, it is blood. Think about what a fully upright neck actually asks of a heart. Blood is heavy. To push it upward against gravity, all the way from the chest to a head held high in the air, the heart has to generate enough pressure to overcome the weight of that entire vertical column of fluid. The taller the column, the harder the push. In a human, standing upright, this is a modest problem, a matter of a few feet. In a giraffe, already remarkable, it demands a blood pressure roughly twice our own, supported by a thick muscular heart and a web of special adaptations. Now stretch that column not to a few feet, but to the height of a raised sauropod head, and the numbers begin to climb towards something no living body has ever matched. This is where the physiologist Roger Seymour did the careful accounting. When you model the pressure needed to lift blood to the brain of a sauropod holding its neck fully vertical, the figure that emerges is around 700 millimeters of mercury at the heart. That number deserves to be sat with slowly. A healthy human heart works at something closer to 120/80 in those same units. A giraffe, the current champion among living animals, runs perhaps 280 at the peak of each beat. 700 is in a different country altogether. It is a pressure that no known cardiovascular system, living or reconstructed, appears able to generate and sustain without tearing itself apart. And the cost is not only in the pump. The heart strong enough to make that pressure would itself have to be enormous, thick-walled muscle-burning fuel around the clock simply to hold blood at the top of the climb. Some estimates put the heart of such an animal at a weight measured in hundreds of pounds, spending a large share of the creature's entire energy budget just fighting gravity in the neck. Every heartbeat would be a small war. The higher the head, the steeper the tax, and the tax rises faster than the reward. At a certain height, the arithmetic simply stops closing. Here is the tactile way to feel it. Picture a narrow column of blood standing straight up from the animal's chest, rising past the height of a one-story roof, past a second floor, up to the level of a third-story window. That whole column has weight, and it presses down without pause against the heart at the bottom. Every second of every hour the head stays raised. The heart cannot rest against that weight. It cannot set the column down. To keep the brain alive, it must hold the entire 3-story stack of fluid aloft continuously, and the strain of that never lets go. When you imagine it that way, the giraffe posture stops looking graceful and starts looking punishing. This is why many researchers now lean toward the sweeper over the reacher. A mostly horizontal neck changes the whole equation. When the head is held roughly level with the heart, there is very little vertical column of blood to fight. The pressure required drops towards something an ordinary large heart could plausibly manage. The animal could feed across a vast arc of ground for hour after unhurried hour, without ever paying the brutal cardiovascular price of lifting its head into the sky. For a creature whose entire life was slow, deliberate eating, that efficiency matters enormously. The low neck is not a compromise. It may be the whole point. If you are listening and drifting, let this next thing settle in gently before the argument goes on. If you're finding a strange comfort in these giants and their slow prehistoric mornings, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let the floodplain come back and the long neck lying level over the ferns. Now, the honest part, because this is not a closed case, and anyone who tells you it is has skipped past the uncertainty. The cardiovascular argument is powerful, but it does not forbid a raised head entirely. It argues against the neck being held vertical as a habitual all-day posture. It says far less about a brief lift, a few seconds of reaching higher to strip a particular branch, or to look across the plain, followed by a return to the comfortable low sweep. Living animals do this all the time, spending most of their hours in the cheap posture and paying the expensive one only in short bursts. A sauropod may well have done the same, feeding low for most of the day and raising its head only occasionally when the reward was worth the strain. There are other threads pulling in other directions too. The way the neck vertebrae fit together at their joints has been studied to guess the neutral resting pose, and different researchers reading the same joints have reached different conclusions, some seeing an upward tilt built into the base of the neck, others seeing a level carriage. Soft tissue that no longer exists, the cartilage between the bones, the muscles and ligaments, all of it changes the answer, and none of it fossilizes cleanly. So the posture debate remains genuinely open, a live area of biomechanical research rather than a settled fact. What the blood pressure work did was not end the argument, it reshaped it, moving the burden of proof onto anyone who wants to stand that neck fully upright for hours at a time. And this is where the neck becomes concrete again, because the same bones that raise the posture question also carry a second, better understood marvel inside them. Those enormous neck vertebrae were not solid. They were riddled with air. A bird-like breathing system extended pockets of air deep into the bone itself, hollowing it out until an average vertebra in the neck was roughly 60% empty space by volume, air where you might expect dense mineral. The bone that remained was arranged in thin struts and walls, a scaffold of surprising delicacy wrapped around large voids. Sit with what that lightness brought. By filling the neck bones with air instead of marrow and mineral, a sauropod could grow a neck substantially longer than a similarly built animal could otherwise carry, on the order of 2/3 longer for the same skeletal weight. The air did not make the neck weightless, but it made length affordable. It is part of how these bodies reach sizes that still strain belief, a respiratory trick borrowed by the same lineage that would one day become birds, turning heavy bone into something closer to a stiffened air-filled boom. Notice how the two facts speak to each other. The pneumatic bone made a very long neck physically possible to build and to hold up, lightening the load the muscles had to support. The cardiovascular ceiling then constrained how that long neck could be used, arguing against holding it high for hours. One fact is about construction, the other about operation, and together they sketch an animal that could grow an astonishing neck, precisely because it was light, yet probably carried it low because blood is heavy and gravity does not negotiate. That is the honest shape of the current understanding, not a single clean answer, but two well-supported facts holding each other in tension, with the exact resting angle still being worked out over articulated vertebrae and physiological models. So when you picture these creatures now, hold both images at once and let neither harden into certainty. The reacher and the sweeper are not rivals so much as two readings of a body we cannot watch move. Perhaps the truth lived between them, a neck usually low and level over the ferns, lifted now and then in a brief expensive climb, then lowered again to sweep the wet ground in the long slow arc of an ordinary morning. The bones allow it, the blood limits it. The full answer waits in fossils not yet found and models not yet built, and there is a certain peace in letting a question that large stay open a while longer. Everything so far, the reaching necks and the pneumatic bone and the arguing hearts, belong to animals we know reasonably well, giants measured from real skeletons dug from real rock. These were among the best-known giants ever found, and yet not one of them held the records that come next. These were among the best-known giants ever found, and yet not one of them held the records that come next. These were among the best-known giants ever found, and yet not one of them held the records that come next. Completeness and record size are not the same prize. The animals you have walked beside so far were measured because so much of them survived. Enough bone to trust the numbers, enough skeleton to build a mount you could stand under. But the true record breakers are a different kind of giant. They are known from less, sometimes from almost nothing, and yet the fragments they left behind are so enormous that they push past every animal counted before them. Tonight you meet three of them, the longest, the widest, and the heaviest, a title still argued over by careful people who have spent their lives weighing the dead. Begin with length and travel back to the late Jurassic, roughly 150 million years ago, to the Morrison Formation of the American West. You have stood here before. It is a seasonal floodplain of braided rivers and conifer groves, of tree ferns and cycads and ginkgos, with no grass anywhere on the planet yet. The ground is ferns and horsetails instead of lawn. In the dry months, a fine dust hangs in the air, sometimes thickened by the smoke of distant wildfire. Then the monsoon comes, and shallow lakes spread across the plain, and the mud goes soft and dark. Into that landscape walk the longest animals the land has ever carried. The animal is Supersaurus viviani, a diplodocid, which means it belongs to the long, low, whip-tailed branch of the sauropod family, rather than the tall-shouldered brachiosaurs. Its most famous skeleton has a nickname. Paleontologists call it Jimbo, and it rests today in the Dinosaur Journey Museum in Fruita, Colorado. The standard reconstruction of Jimbo, the mount you could walk the length of, measures about 106 feet from nose to tail tip. Hold that number for a moment. 106 feet is longer than 3 school buses parked end to end. It is a single animal you could not photograph up close without backing away until it became small. And 106 feet may be the conservative figure. Ongoing work by the paleontologist Brian Curtis, who has spent years redescribing this animal bone by bone, has pushed the estimates higher. His reconstruction argues that Supersaurus had an unusually long neck, an unusually long tail, and enormous shoulder blades, and that when you account for all of them honestly, the animal stretches to somewhere between 128 and 137 feet. That upper figure would make Supersaurus the single longest dinosaur for which we have real, physical bone to point at, not a legend, not a lost measurement, an actual skeleton in an actual drawer. You should treat those larger numbers with the same care the scientists do. This work has not yet been published in full as a peer-reviewed monograph, which is the formal, checked permanent record that paleontology runs on. Until that publication exists, the figures of 128 to 137 feet are best held as provisional, a strong and serious estimate that has not yet passed through every gate. It is worth saying that plainly, because the honest version of this story is more interesting than the loud one. What we can say firmly is that Supersaurus was longer than almost anything else on land, and that the exact number is still being settled by patient hands. There is one thing about Jimbo we no longer have to guess. In 2024, researchers studied the microscopic structure of its bones, a technique called osteohistology. When you cut a thin slice of fossil bone and hold it to the light, you can read the growth rings inside it, much as you read the rings of a felled tree. Those rings record the years, and they record something else, the moment when growth slows and stops. The study found that Jimbo had reached full skeletal maturity. This was not a still-growing youngster who might have doubled in size. This was an adult, close to the ceiling of what its species became. The longest dinosaur we can point to was already in life, near the largest it would ever be. Picture the animal moving. A diplodocid did not rear up to browse treetops the way you might imagine. Its neck swept out ahead of it, long and mostly level, a living crane boom reaching side to side across the ferns. Behind it trailed a tail so long and so finely tapered that its final third narrowed to something like a bullwhip. The whole animal, front to back, would have taken you many long seconds to walk past at an easy pace, and it moved slowly, deliberately, a high walking wall of flesh crossing the floodplain with no need to hurry, because nothing on that plain was faster than its own patience. Now leave the Jurassic behind and cross both an ocean of time and a real ocean of distance, south to Patagonia, to the very end of the age of dinosaurs. You are in what is now Santa Cruz Province, in southern Argentina, near the town of Rio Gallegos, in rocks that formed roughly 70 million years ago in the last chapter of the Cretaceous. The world here is warm and seasonal, a country of river floodplains and interdune ponds. Early flowering plants are spreading now, mixing with older conifers and podocarps and endless ferns. Volcanic ash drifts down from the young Andean highlands to the west, settling over the ground in pale layers, and that ash is part of why so much survives here. It buries things whole. What it buried, in this case, were 4 articulated vertebrae. Articulated is a precious word to a paleontologist. It means the bones were found in their true living order, still lined up as they sat in the animal, not scattered and jumbled by rivers and scavengers. 4 backbones, in sequence, from an animal named in 2005 as Puertasaurus roili. That is all we have of it. 4 bones, and yet those 4 bones carry one of the great records of the sauropod world. One of them is a dorsal vertebra, a bone from the back, and it measures 1.68 meters across, which is about 5 feet 6 inches wide. That is the broadest vertebra known from any sauropod that has ever been found. Sit with the strangeness of that. A single unit of backbone, one segment of spine, as wide as a grown person, is tall. If it stood upright before you, its top edge would be at eye level. Here is the way to feel it. Imagine a family dinner table, the kind that seats 6 or 8 people for a long evening meal. Now tip that table up onto its edge, so it stands like a great flat wheel taller than you are. A single backbone of Puertasaurus was broader than that table stood on edge. Not the whole animal, not the rib cage. One bone from the middle of its spine, and roughly 2/3 of that enormous width, was not the core of the vertebra at all, but 2 wing-like projections sweeping out to either side, the diapophyses, the struts where the muscles and ribs anchored. The animal wore its spine like a set of outstretched arms, spreading the load of its own colossal body. Because we have so little of Puertasaurus, everything else about its size is scaled, estimated by comparing those 4 bones to more complete relatives and reasoning outward. Do that carefully, and the animal comes out at roughly 100 to 115 feet long, and possibly 80 to 90 tons or more in weight, which places it among the very heaviest creatures ever to press its feet into mud. But you should always remember the honest limit here. We are reconstructing a skyscraper from 4 of its bricks. The bricks are real, and they are gigantic, and the building we imagine around them is a best guess made by people who know brick and building well. That is the quiet lesson these record breakers keep teaching. The bigger the animal, the rarer the complete skeleton, because the largest bodies were the hardest for the earth to bury whole and the hardest for time to keep. So the animals most likely to hold the records are precisely the animals we know the least about. The evidence thins exactly where the wonder thickens. If you are finding a slow companion in these giants, in the long walk from bone to bone, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It costs you nothing, and it keeps the quiet company going night after night, giant after giant. Which brings you to the heaviest and to the most honest argument in all of dinosaur science. Because when people ask which animal was the largest ever to walk the earth, they are usually asking about weight, and weight is the hardest thing of all to recover from stone. Length you can lay a tape against. Weight is volume, and volume is flesh, and flesh does not fossilize. To weigh a dinosaur, you must first imagine the living body wrapped around the bones, and reasonable people imagine differently. The first contender is Argentinosaurus huinculensis, found in Neuquén Province, Argentina, in the Huincal Formation, in rocks that formed between about 97 and 93 million years ago. For a long time this animal has worn the crown of heaviest by reputation, and here is what it is actually known from. About 9 incomplete vertebrae, a partial femur, the thigh bone, a fibula, one of the lower leg bones, some fragments of rib, that is the whole of it. Every popular weight you have ever heard for Argentinosaurus is a scaled reconstruction, built out from that handful of pieces. Not one figure is a direct measurement of complete animal, because no complete animal exists. But look at the pieces themselves and you understand the awe. A single back vertebra of Argentinosaurus stands taller than a grown person. Reconstructions of its femur run to around 8 feet in length, a thigh bone you could not lift, a bone as tall as a doorway. From material like this, a rigorous scaling study in 2004 estimated the animal at approximately 73 metric tons, which is around 80 US tons. The authors of that study chose their words with the care the subject deserves. They called Argentinosaurus the largest of all land animals whose mass has been rigorously obtained, not the largest that ever lived, the largest whose weight had been worked out by a defensible method. That distinction is the whole heart of tonight. Other estimates have run higher still, reaching 90 tons, even past 100 tons, depending on how much flesh you drape over the frame and which relatives you scale from. Its length is put at somewhere around 98 to 115 feet. Whatever the exact number, you're looking at an animal that weighed as much as a dozen or more African elephants gathered into one slow body. An animal whose every footfall drove a foot the size of a trash can lid deep into the floodplain, sending a low thud through the ground that you would have felt in your chest before you heard it. The second contender is younger to science and far better known, Patagotitan majorum. In 2012 and 2013, at a single quarry near La Flecha in Chubut Province, Argentina, excavators uncovered the bones of at least 6 individuals stacked together in one place, and from that extraordinary haul they assembled the most complete skeleton of any giant titanosaur we have. The animal was formally named in 2017 because so much of it survives. Casts of Patagotitan now stand in museum halls around the world, and it is often introduced on the placard and in the headline as the largest dinosaur ever found. And this is exactly where you must slow down and be honest, because the headline hides a real subtlety. When Patagotitan was first described in 2017, the initial estimates gave it a length of about 121 feet and a mass of around 69 metric tons, roughly 76 US tons, enormous figures. But science did not stop at the first estimate. Later analyses, using more conservative volumetric methods that model the animal as a 3-dimensional body and refuse to overinflate the soft tissue, revised those numbers downward. The length came down to about 102 feet. The mass came down to somewhere between 50 and 60 tons, still one of the largest animals in the history of the planet, but brought into line with its close relatives rather than towering dramatically above them. So set the two side by side, and you find that the contest is not really between two weights. It is between two kinds of knowing. Patagotitan is the best documented giant, the one with the most bone in the ground, which is why it so often gets called the biggest. Argentinosaurus is the more fragmentary animal, known from those 9 vertebrae and a broken leg, and yet its bones are so large that most sauropod specialists judge it to be at least as heavy as Patagotitan, and quite possibly heavier. Best documented and likely biggest are 2 different questions. They do not have to share an answer. This is not a soft disagreement. In 2017, paleontologist Michael Taylor, who has spent his career on the vertebrae of exactly these animals, wrote a direct and pointed rebuttal to the media claims that Patagotitan had dethroned Argentinosaurus. His argument, put simply, was that the surviving bones do not support the coronation. Where you can compare equivalent bones between the 2 animals, Argentinosaurus holds its own and often comes out larger. The excitement of a fresh, near-complete skeleton is real and earned, but excitement is not measurement. That blog rebuttal is not itself a peer-reviewed paper, and it is fair to note that, but it captures the settled view of many specialists. The likely heaviest animal we can name is still, on the best current reading of the bones, Argentinosaurus. Notice what that means for certainty. We cannot put either animal on a scale. We will never watch one step onto a platform and read a number. Everything we say about their weight is an argument from geometry and living relatives, from the thickness of a leg bone and the breadth of a vertebra. And the disagreements are not signs that the science is broken. They are signs that it is working, that careful people are holding one another to the evidence and refusing to round up for the sake of a better story. The number 73 tons, offered so carefully in 2004, is more valuable than any louder claim precisely because it came wrapped in its own limits. Step back now and take in what these three animals share beyond their size. Every one of them is a story of the largest bodies being the rarest finds. Supersaurus, longest of all, known well from a single mature skeleton and pushed to its record length by work still unfinished. Puertasaurus, widest of all, known from 4 bones and one impossible vertebra broader than a table stood on edge. Argentinosaurus, heaviest of all, known from 9 vertebrae and a shattered leg, and still, on the balance of evidence, the champion of mass. The record holders are the ghosts. They loom largest precisely where the fossil record grows thinnest, and that is not an accident. It is the deep pattern of this whole subject. Flesh at that scale rarely survives its own burial. There is a strange comfort in that, if you let it settle over you as you drift. These animals were not built to be counted. They were built to eat all day slowly, cropping ferns and conifer shoots by the hundredweight, converting whole hillsides of green into bone and muscle, and the long patient business of being enormous. They did not know they were records. They walked their floodplains in the ordinary way, feeling the ash sift down, feeling the ground go soft in the wet season, moving at the unhurried pace that only the truly vast can afford. The measuring came 70 million years later from us, and the measuring is hard, and that difficulty is a kind of tribute. They were too big for the earth to keep whole, so when you hear a single confident number for the largest creature that ever walked the land, hold it gently. Behind that number is a fragment of bone in a museum drawer, a scaling equation, a careful scientist writing the word approximately, and an honest argument that has not fully ended. The giants are real. The exact size of the largest of them lives, and will likely always live, inside a range rather than a point. That is not a failure of knowledge. It is the true shape of it, and there is one more turn to take before you sleep, one more door in the dark. Because tonight you have met only the giants rigorous enough to weigh and measure, the ones with bone enough in the ground to defend a number. Beyond them, at the very edge of the record and the very edge of the evidence, stand other giants still. Larger, some say. Impossible, others answer. Known from a drawing lost to monsoon rain, or a vertebra described once in the year 1878 and never seen again. They cannot be ranked. They cannot be trusted the way these three can be trusted, but they cannot quite be dismissed either, and they wait at the border of the countable world. Consider how little the biggest numbers actually rest on. Not a whole animal, most of the time. A single object instead, one bone heavy enough to carry a claim. Walk the quarry floors slowly, and you can meet these anchor bones one at a time, each one lying alone in its drawer or its plaster jacket, each one asked to speak for a body that vanished long ago. Start in the far south of Argentina, near Rio Gallegos, in rock laid down about 70 million years ago. In 2005, a team described 4 vertebrae from that place, found locked together in a line. One of them, a bone from the middle of the back, measures 5 feet 6 inches across. Lay a tape over it and you span the width of a small car. This is Puertasaurus, and that single vertebra is the broadest known for any sauropod, from anywhere, from any age of the earth. Most of that width is not the solid core of the bone at all. It is a pair of wing-like flanges spreading out to either side, thin plates that once braced muscle and rib. The whole animal is scaled from this bone and its 3 companions, and nothing else. Everything you might guess about its length, its weight, its standing height, hangs from 4 objects you could fit on a single table. Move north now to Mendoza province, and to a bone shaped like a great upper arm. This is the humerus of Notocolossus, described in 2016. It runs 5 feet 9 inches from end to end, and close to 2 feet 4 inches across the wide head where it met the shoulder. Stand it upright, and it reaches your chest. At the moment it was named, that was the longest and widest upper arm bone of any titanosaur ever measured. Records like this one are quiet things. They do not last forever, and they were never meant to. This year, in 2026, a newly described titanosaur called Namadicus slipped past it, its own humerus reaching 5 feet 10 inches, a single inch longer. 1 inch, across tens of millions of years, is enough to carry a title from one museum drawer to another, without either animal ever knowing. Notice what you're actually holding when you hold these bones. Not the beast. A joint, an arm, a length of spine. The size of the living creature is a calculation built outward from that one hard fact, the way you might reconstruct a room from the shadow of a single window. Paleontologists do this carefully, with equations drawn from more complete relatives, but the honesty of the work lives in admitting where the measured bone stops and the estimate begins. Follow the map a little further to Lake Borealis in Yukon, where in the year 2000 a team began pulling out one of the most complete giant titanosaurs ever found. This is Futalognkosaurus, known from something like 70% of its skeleton, gathered across 3 individuals. Even here, with so much recovered, it is a handful of numbers that do the heavy lifting. Its paired hip bones, the broad blades called ilia, spread about 8 feet 4 inches from side to side. Sit with that figure for a moment. That is not the animal's length, nor its height, nor the span of its neck. That is the width of its hips alone, the bony basket that cradled a vast fermenting gut. Imagine standing at the tail and looking forward along the line of the back. The first thing to meet you would be a pelvis, wider than most doorways at all. The neck ahead of it carried tall neural spines shaped like shark fins, and in places that neck stood more than a yard deep from top to bottom. This is a good place to pause and simply keep company with you for a moment, wherever you happen to be resting. If these slow walks through deep time are the kind of thing you want more of, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let the quarry come back into focus and the bones with it. Now to the animal that sits at the very top of most heavy lists and rests on the thinnest scatter of material of all. Argentinosaurus was found in Yukon province, in rock roughly 95 million years old. It is often called the largest land animal, whose mass has been worked out with any real rigour. A careful study in 2004 put that mass near 73 tons, and other estimates push higher still, toward 90 tons and beyond. And yet the entire animal is known from about 9 incomplete vertebrae, a partial thigh bone, part of a shin, and some broken pieces of rib. That is the whole of the evidence. 9 vertebrae, though each is the size of a kitchen appliance standing in for a body that may have stretched past 100 feet. Every popular figure you have ever heard for this creature is a scaled reconstruction, an inference, not a number taken directly off the living beast. The bones are real. The giant around them is a reasoned shape drawn in the air. There is a particular calm in seeing it stated so plainly. The largest thing that ever walked on land is, in the museum, a short row of stone shapes in a climate-controlled room. The rest is arithmetic and patience. Not every size clue comes from a bone in a drawer, though. Some of the most vivid are prints in old mud. Travel to a place called Calorco, where a limestone wall has been tilted almost upright by the slow shove of mountain building. Across that near-vertical face lie thousands upon thousands of dinosaur footprints, and among them are titanosaur tracks up to about 4 feet long. Set your own foot beside that outline and it nearly disappears. These were pressed into soft lakeside mud roughly 68 million years ago, then buried, hardened, and lifted back toward the sky. You're not looking at the animal, and not even at its bones. You're looking at the exact shape of the space its foot pushed aside, one unhurried step at a time, along a shoreline that no longer exists. The stride between prints lets you feel the pace, slow and deliberate, a body so heavy it could only move with care. There is something honest in that too. The footprint records the foot and nothing more. Whether the creature that made it weighed 60 tons or 80, the mud does not say. It kept the soul and let the rest go. Return one last time to the quarry floor and lie a single bone out flat where you can walk its length. Picture the shoulder blade of one of these giants stretched across the cleared rock. In the longest sauropods, that one blade runs longer than a canoe you might haul down to a lake. You could pace its length and count several full strides before you reach the far end. It is a strange thing to stand over, a single flat bone that dwarfs your whole body, laid in the dust exactly as it settled when the animal came apart. This is how the largest creatures reach us, not as complete skeletons standing ready in a hall, but as scattered enormous pieces, a vertebra here, an arm bone there, a hip blade, a print in stone, each one recovered years or decades apart, each one carrying more weight of meaning than its share of the animal ever did in life. That is the quiet truth underneath every ranking of the giants. The confidence of the numbers and the poverty of the bones sit side by side. A width of 5 feet 6 inches across one backbone, a humerus of 5 feet 9 inches, then 5 feet 10 inches, a title traded on a single inch, a hip spread of 8 feet 4 inches, 9 vertebrae for the heaviest of them all, a footprint 4 feet across, pressed into a vanished shore. These are the hard, measurable objects, the ones you could weigh in your hands and read with a tape, and they are precious precisely because they are so few. The animals were vast. The evidence is small and specific and real. Hold that balance gently as you drift. Every giant in this catalogue earns its place by leaving behind at least one object solid enough to measure, one anchor of bone or print that a careful person can stand over and record without guessing. That is the boundary this quiet ledger keeps. On one side, the giants we can weigh, however roughly, because they left us something to hold. For every giant we can weigh and measure, there is another we can only wonder about. For every giant we can weigh and measure, there is another we can only wonder about. For every giant we can weigh and measure, there is another we can only wonder about. These are the animals that sit just outside the ranking, close enough to brush the edge of it, and still impossible to place with any honesty. They are not frauds. They are not fantasies. They are the ones whose bones slipped through our hands before science could hold them still. In the quiet accounting of the largest creatures that ever walked the earth, they deserve a place of their own, set gently off to one side. You speak of them the way you speak of someone who left the room before you learned their name. Begin in southern India, in rocks laid down near the very end of the age of dinosaurs. In 1989, 2 geologists, Yadagiri and Ayasami, published a short scientific paper describing a set of truly enormous bones. They gave the animal a name that has haunted the edges of this subject ever since: Brachiosaurus. On paper, the numbers were staggering. Some readings of that original description put the animal at somewhere between 110 and 170 tons. If that were true, it would not merely join this list, it would sit at the very top of it, heavier than any titanosaur, heavier than anything else that has ever pressed a foot into the earth. And yet you will notice it is not on the list. There is a reason for that, and the reason is simple, and a little sad. The bones are gone. According to the accounts that survive, the original fossil material was left in the field, and the monsoon rains came, and the material reportedly softened and disintegrated back into the ground it came from. It was never formally redescribed. No casts of it circulate through the world's museums. No careful second study ever laid calipers against it. What remains of Brachiosaurus is not bone at all. It is a set of field drawings and measurements, sketches made in the moment, before anyone understood what they might be holding. Picture that for a moment, calmly, the way you might picture something slipping just out of reach. A fossil is not a rock that lasts forever. It is a fragile thing, mineral where bone once was, and it can crack, crumble, and wash away like anything else exposed to weather. A lost bone left out in the monsoon does not shatter like glass. It softens like a piece of wet chalk set out in the rain, its edges rounding, its surface going to paste, the fine detail dissolving hour by hour until the shape you remember is only a shape in your memory. That is what happened here, if the accounts are right. The evidence quite literally returned to mud. There is a further complication, and it is worth stating plainly, because honesty is the whole point of this segment. Some paleontologists who have studied the surviving drawings have raised a quiet suspicion. They wonder whether the object described as a giant femur, a colossal thigh bone, may not have been bone at all. It may have been petrified wood, a fossilized tree trunk mistaken in the field for the leg of a monster. We cannot know. The material that would settle the question no longer exists, and that uncertainty, that inability to go back and check, is exactly why Brachiosaurus cannot be responsibly ranked among the giants we can weigh. This is not a matter of doubting the people who found it. Fieldwork is hard, and the rocks of that region are difficult, and a hurried excavation before the rains is a race that nature often wins. It is simply that science, at its most careful, asks a single stubborn question of every record it keeps. Can someone else go and look? Can the bone be measured again, by other hands, with other eyes? When the answer is no, when the object of the claim is washed away, the number cannot stand as fact. It becomes a rumour of a giant, an enormous maybe, and you set it gently aside. So Brachiosaurus waits there, in the margin, neither confirmed nor dismissed. It may have been the largest land animal that ever lived. It may have been an ordinary giant no bigger than the titanosaurs we can measure. It may, in part, have been a tree. All three possibilities remain open, and none of them can be closed, and there is a strange peace in admitting that. Not every question has an answer you get to keep. Now travel back much further in time, and much further west to the American frontier of the late 19th century, and to a bone that vanished in a different way. The animal is called Marapunisaurus fragilimus. For most of its history it went by another name, Amphicoleus fragilimus, and you may still see that older name repeated in books and across the internet, often attached to a truly extraordinary claim. The claim begins with a single vertebra. In 1878, the great American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope described a fragment of a giant, a single bone from the backbone of a sauropod, recovered from the rocks of the American West. Cope was one of the towering figures of early dinosaur science, a man of ferocious energy and enormous output, and when he measured this vertebra he recorded a size so vast that, scaled up to a whole animal, it implied a creature beyond anything else known. From that one bone came the legend, an animal perhaps 190 feet long. On paper, the longest creature ever to walk the earth, longer than a blue whale, longer than the Supersaurus we can actually measure, a serpent of a dinosaur stretched out across the Jurassic floodplain. And then, like Brachiosaurus a century later, the bone disappeared. Cope's giant vertebra was described and drawn, and then lost, and it has never been seen again. No one alive has held it. No museum drawer contains it. All that survives is Cope's own account, his figures and his measurements, printed in 1878 and passed down ever since like an heirloom whose original owner no one remembers. For well over a century that 190-foot figure floated through popular writing as a kind of record that could never be broken, precisely because it could never be tested. But science is patient, and it circles back. In the years around 2014 and 2015, researchers, among them the paleontologists Woodruff and Foster, went back to Cope's original 1878 description and studied it with fresh and careful eyes. They looked not at the bone, which was gone, but at the numbers themselves, and at how 19th century measurements were recorded and printed. What they concluded is quietly deflating, in the gentlest way. They argued that the original measurements very likely contained a simple transcription error, a slip in recording, a figure written down or set in type a little larger than the animal truly was. Correct for that plausible mistake, and the giant shrinks, not to nothing, not to something ordinary. Marapunisaurus in this reading was still an enormous animal, a genuine heavyweight of the Jurassic, worthy of respect. But it was probably not the singular, record-shattering colossus that the 190-foot number promised. The reanalysis suggested the famous figure is most likely an overstatement of an animal that was still huge, only human, and only measured once, by a person who could not go back and check his own work. That is why the reanalysis also gave the animal a new name and a new home in the family tree, moving it away from its old relatives and recognizing it as its own creature, Morrison fragilimus. The species name, fragilimus, points to the delicate, thin-walled, air-filled construction of that lost vertebra, the same feathery lightness that let real sauropods grow so large. There is a small irony in it. The most fragile giant of all, named for its fragility, undone in the end by the fragility of a single sheet of numbers. Set these two animals side by side, Brachiosaurus washed into the Indian mud, and Palaeoloxodon lost somewhere in the American 19th century, and you can see the honest principle they share. In both cases, an extraordinary size was claimed. In both cases, the physical evidence is gone. And in both cases, science does the same disciplined, slightly disappointing thing. It refuses to count what it cannot check. This is worth sitting with, because it runs against the grain of how we usually enjoy giants. The temptation, always, is to reach for the biggest possible number, to crown the largest claimant and be done. But the largest claim and the best evidence are not the same thing, and the whole quiet integrity of the subject rests on keeping them apart. A measurement you cannot repeat is not a fact. It is a memory of a measurement. The story of the largest animals is really two stories braided together, the story of what was truly enormous, and the story of what we can actually prove, and the honest teller keeps both in view at once. So the lost giants do not vanish from the account entirely. They are simply held at arm's length, in a softer light, spoken of as possibilities rather than record holders. Brachiosaurus and Morrison sit to one side of the ranking, unweighed and unweighable, two magnificent question marks, and there is no shame in that. A science honest enough to leave a blank where the evidence is blank is a science you can trust with the numbers it does keep. Let the mind drift now from the animals we lost track of to the world that lost track of all of them at once. Because the true giants, the ones we can weigh and the ones we only guess at, share a single ending. They walked to the very edge of the age of dinosaurs, and then they were gone. Follow the last of them across the floodplains of the latest Cretaceous, the world of Puertasaurus and its kin, roughly 70 million years ago and after, in the warm river valleys of what is now Patagonia. This was still a titanosaur world. The broad-backed giants still moved across the seasonal plains, still swept their long necks low across the ferns and the young flowering plants that had spread among the older conifers. On a nearly vertical wall of stone near Sucre in Bolivia, more than 12,000 fossil footprints record that late world in motion. Titanosaur tracks up to about 4 feet long, pressed into what was once soft lakeside mud, dated to around 68 million years ago. Giants were still walking, the trackways prove it. They walked, unhurried, almost to the end. And then the age of dinosaurs closed. The end of the Cretaceous is one of the great turning points in the history of life, the boundary after which the giant sauropods no longer appear in the rocks at all. It is easy to imagine that ending as a single violent night, and it may well have been sudden by the measure of deep time. But from inside the world, at the pace of an animal that spent its whole day quietly eating, the change would have been felt as the slow failure of ordinary things, seasons that did not turn as they should, skies that did not clear, plains that did not green again on schedule. Here it is worth being calm and careful, because the details of that ending are studied hard and still argued over, and this segment will not pretend to more certainty than the rocks allow. What the fossil record shows plainly is the outcome. Below the boundary, giants. Above it, none. The largest land animals that ever lived do not taper away across the following epochs. They stop. The titanosaurs that had ruled the southern continents, the long-necked colossi weighing as much as 10 elephants apiece, simply do not cross that line. Think about what it takes to feed an animal like that, and you begin to feel why the giants were so exposed. A titanosaur was a vast slow furnace of a body, a high biomass herbivore that spent most of its waking hours simply gathering enough green to keep itself alive. That way of living works beautifully in a stable, productive world. A world of reliable plant growth season after season. It is a terrible bet in a world where the plants suddenly fail. The bigger the animal, the more it must eat, and the less it can afford a long famine. Size, the very thing that had made them untouchable, became the thing that could not be sustained. You can picture it without drama, which is how it likely happened for most of them. Not a single catastrophic instant for each animal, but a gradual thinning. Fewer clutches of eggs at the old nesting grounds, the sprawling nurseries like Arcamahuevo where titanosaurs had returned for generations to lay their eggs in the warm ash and sand. Then fewer hatchlings surviving their first hard seasons. Then the great adults, the ones already grown, walking the same familiar floodplains they always had, across a landscape that fed them a little less each year. The giants did not need to be struck down one by one. They only needed to stop being replaced. And so, across the closing chapters of the Cretaceous, the largest bodies on land quietly ran out of world to hold them. There is no need to make it loud. In the span of deep time it was quick enough to read almost as a single line in the rock, a boundary you could cover with your hand. To the animals living through it, it would have been the ordinary tragedy of a home that slowly stops providing, played out over years, then decades, then longer. The last generation of true giants was, without knowing it, the last. Let that settle, softly, the way dusk settles over a wide plain. The titanosaur floodplains did not end in fire alone in the imagination. They ended in stillness. The low thud of a footfall the size of a trash can lid, driven into wet mud, felt through the ground more than heard, grew rarer along the river valleys, and then it was not felt at all. The broad trails that giant feet had worn across the floodplain stopped being freshened. Wind moved across the ferns, the rivers went on braiding and flooding and drying as they always had, indifferent, and the enormous shapes that had waded through them for tens of millions of years were no longer there to cast their shadows on the water. Somewhere out on those last Patagonian plains, a final titanosaur lay down in the mud and did not rise, and the slow chemistry of burial began, the same patient process that had preserved so many of its ancestors for us to find. Ash and sediment closed over it. Water carried minerals into the tiny air spaces of its bones, and over the long dark that followed, that body became stone and waited silent through everything that came after for hands that would not exist for another 66 million years. That is the strange gift hidden inside the ending. The giants vanished from the living world, but not all of them vanished from the record. The ones that were buried well, quickly, under ashen river silt, are the reason we can weigh any of them at all. Dreadnoughtus, more than 70% complete, lay in the ground for tens of millions of years so that we could argue about its mass. Patagotitan left at least 6 individuals stacked in a single quarry. Even the lost ones, Brachiosaurus and Morrison, are lost only because the record failed them at the last step, because the rain came or the vertebra slipped away. The extinction that ended the giants also began the long process that would, eventually, let us count them, and the ones we cannot count keep their quiet place at the edge of the ranking, neither in nor out. That is not a failure of the science. It is the shape of the science working exactly as it should, patient enough to say we do not know, generous enough to let a giant remain a giant in the imagination, even when it cannot be a giant in the ledger. The lost ones do not need to be crowned to be remembered. They only need to be spoken of honestly, which is what you have done here, in the calm before the last of the light. So the picture pulls slowly back now, up and away from the individual animal in the mud, up over the braided rivers and the drying into dune ponds, up over the whole warm sweep of the late Cretaceous plain where the largest creatures the land ever carried had walked their unhurried walk. The tracks are still pressed into the ground down there, hardening towards stone. The nesting grounds are quiet. The long necks are lowered for the last time across the ferns, and the world holds its breath in the failing season and does not let it go. Whatever the giants had been, whatever they weighed, whichever of them was truly the heaviest thing ever to press a foot into the earth, that question is closing now along with the age that asked it. The plains grow dim, the great shapes go still against the dusk. The light comes first, before the animal. It is mid-morning on a Patagonian floodplain, roughly 80 million years ago. The sun stands high and white above a wide, slow river. The air is warm and faintly heavy, the way air sits before a season turns. Ferns cover the ground in low green banks. No grass exists anywhere on earth yet, so the floor of this world is fern and horsetail and the litter of fallen needles. Podocarp trees rise in dark, resinous clusters. Among them, low and new, the first flowering plants have begun to spread. Into this stillness, an animal the weight of 10 elephants moves at a walk. She is a titanosaur, one of the great giants of the southern continents. Her back lifts higher than the tallest tree ferns around her. Her neck runs out ahead of her body like a long, level boom, held not upright but low, sweeping slowly from one side to the other. This is how she reads the plain. Not with speed, not with hunger's urgency, but with the patient sweep of a creature that has nowhere it needs to be. Watch her for a single hour, and almost the only thing she does is eat. That is the honest truth of a body this size. 60 tons of animal cannot be fueled in quick, tidy meals. It must be fed almost without pause, hour after hour, through the whole long warmth of the day. So she crops the crowns of the ferns and the low fronds of the podocarps, tearing loose great mouthfuls and swallowing them nearly whole. Her teeth are simple pegs, made for raking leaves free, not for grinding them down. The real work happens deeper, inside a gut so vast it functions like a slow, warm vat, breaking the day's foliage apart across many quiet hours. Her head is small. This tends to surprise people. On an animal this immense, the skull is barely larger than a horse's, a light basket of bone at the end of that enormous neck. It has to be light. A heavy head swung out on 40 feet of neck would be an impossible burden to hold level, so evolution pared it down to the smallest tool that could still gather leaves. The neck itself is a study in lightness. Each of the great vertebrae strung inside it is riddled with air, hollowed by pockets that once connected to a bird-like system of air sacs threaded through the body. On average, a sauropod's neck bone was close to 60% air by volume. That is how she carries so much length out in front of herself without tipping forward. The bones are built like the airy inside of a loaf, more open space than solid matter, dense along the lines that bear the load, and nearly empty everywhere else. A single one of her back vertebrae, if you could lift it free and stand it on the mud, would be wider than a dinner table. One thigh bone alone would rise as tall as a grown person standing quietly beside it. How she held that neck through the day is something paleontologists still weigh carefully. You might imagine her rearing it high, browsing treetops like a giraffe. The math makes that harder to believe. Modelling of the blood pressure needed to push blood all the way up to a fully vertical head suggests figures around 700 millimeters of mercury at the heart, far beyond what any known cardiovascular system could safely sustain. So most researchers now lean toward the low posture, the neck swept mostly sideways and level, like a crane boom moving over the ground. It is not fully settled. It remains a live question, argued in journals rather than closed. But watch her here, and the low sweep looks right. It costs her almost nothing to feed this way. Now she shifts her weight to move a few body lengths downriver toward a fresh stand of ferns. Watch the foot. The forefoot lifts, a column of muscle and bone as thick as a tree trunk, and swings forward with surprising smoothness. Then it comes down. The sole of that foot is broad and round, roughly the size of a trash can lid, and it meets the wet floodplain mud not with a slap but with a slow settling. The mud is soft here, soaked by the last rains, and the foot presses into it the way a thumb sinks slowly into a mound of soft dough, the surface giving, closing up around the edges, holding the shape for a moment after the pressure eases. What you feel, standing nearby, is less a sound than a sensation. A low thud carried up through the ground and into the soles of your own feet, more felt than heard, the ground itself passing the weight along. Whether she made any sound with her throat we simply cannot say. There is no fossil evidence of a titanosaur's voice, none at all. People sometimes imagine these giants trading deep infrasonic calls the way elephants do, low rumbles rolling for miles across the plain. It is a lovely idea, and it may even be true, but it is guesswork borrowed from living animals, not something the bones can confirm. Hold it lightly. The honest picture of this hour is mostly quiet, the quiet of chewing, of breath, of huge feet settling into mud. She feeds on. The river slides past at her flank, brown and unhurried, braiding around low bars of sand. Dragonflies work the shallows. Somewhere out of sight, other titanosaurs move across the same floodplain, their backs breaking the line of the fern beds like slow dark hills that drift and graze. This is a landscape built for animals of her scale, open and green and endlessly renewing. The ferns she strips today will push up new fronds within weeks. The whole plain is a standing larder, and she walks through it, eating the way a river walks downhill, steadily, without deciding to. A film of pale ash dusts some of the leaves. It settles now and then out of a hazy sky, drifting from restless volcanoes rising along the young spine of mountains to the west. She takes it in with her mouthfuls and thinks nothing of it. In time, that same ash will do something remarkable. It will bury the bones and the eggs of animals like her so swiftly and so completely that they will keep their shape across tens of millions of years, which is a large part of why Patagonia holds the finest giant skeletons ever found. But that's all far ahead. Today the ash is only a faint grit on the ferns and a softness in the light. Her breathing is the slowest large sound in the scene. Air moves through that bird-like system in a smooth one-way loop, in through the lungs, out through the sacs, a more efficient bellows than your own chest can manage. It is part of what let her kind grow this enormous in the first place. Light bones, efficient lungs, a small head, a long reach, a gut that could ferment a forest's worth of leaves. Every part of her is an answer to the single problem of being this big and staying alive. The hour turns, the sun climbs a little higher, and the heat lies flat across the plain. She slows further, if that is even possible, and simply stands for a while among the ferns, jaws working, tail resting its great length along the ground behind her. A grown person could walk the length of that tail and grow tired before reaching the tip. From nose to tail she measures more than 90 feet, longer than the river is wide here. And yet at rest she makes almost no impression on the world. A green hill breathing, a shadow that barely moves. This is the shape of nearly every day she has known. Rise in the warm dawn, walk, feed, stand, feed again, drift toward water, feed some more, and lower herself down at dusk to rest her weight against the cooling earth. There is no drama in it. That is the point of her. These were not fast animals, not fierce ones, not restless. They were slow, patient, high biomass herbivores whose whole existence turned on the quiet mathematics of taking in enough green each day to carry a body the size of a barge. The plain fed them, and they walked it, and the seasons came and went across their backs. Stand with her a moment longer as the light begins its long slide toward afternoon. The river keeps sliding. The ferns keep offering up their fronds. Her foot lifts, swings, and settles once more into the soft mud, and the ground carries that low thud outward through the roots and the wet sediment, out to where the other giants graze. For now the floodplain holds them all, warm and green and wide enough, a world that seems built to go on exactly like this without end. It did not go on without end. The warmth these giants moved through, the ferns, the ash-dusted podocarps, the slow rivers threading Patagonia, all of it belonged to a world already drawing toward its close. The titanosaurs did not know it, and there was no reason they should. They simply walked and fed and rested and rose again through days that felt as permanent as the ground itself. One by one, across the final days of the Cretaceous, the largest animals ever to walk the earth grew still. One by one, across the final days of the Cretaceous, the largest animals ever to walk the earth grew still. One by one, across the final days of the Cretaceous, the largest animals ever to walk the earth grew still. Let the view begin close then. Begin in a single Patagonian quarry, the kind of place you have been standing near all this long hour, pale rock the colour of old bone, a femur half out of the ground, taller than you are, resting where a river left it. Around it the quiet work of settling dust. Hold there a moment, close enough to lay a hand on the stone, then let the ground begin, very slowly, to draw away beneath you. The quarry shrinks first. The single bone becomes one pale mark in a hillside. Then the hillside becomes one fold in a wide brown valley. You rise the way a feather rises on warm air, without effort, without hurry. And as you climb, the walls of a single moment fall away, and all the deep time you have travelled tonight opens out below you like a floor of still water. Down there, if you look softly, you can see them all at once. You can see the hornless giant of the old Asian woodlands, the great browsing beast taller at the shoulder than any animal since, stepping through open scrub that had no grass in it anywhere. You can see the straight-tusked elephant of the warm river plains, its uncertain bulk moving through monsoon light. Neither of them was there to be measured. Both left us just enough to argue over, and the argument was gentle, and it does not need to be settled tonight. Pull back a little further. The mammals fold into the green, and the long necks rise. There is the giraffe-postured one of the Jurassic floodplains, front legs longer than its back, reaching into conifer crowns that other giants could not touch. There is the tall one from the Oklahoma rock, known from 4 bones in the neck and nothing more, its head lifted higher than any dinosaur we have ever found. They stand in a landscape with no flowers yet, only ferns and horsetails and the smell of dry season smoke, and they do not know they are the first chapter of something. Keep rising. The land below turns from Jurassic gold to Cretaceous green, and Patagonia spreads out under you. There is the broad-hipped one from the lake shore, 70 hundredths of its skeleton gathered back out of the ground. There is the one named for its enormous arm bone, and the one so complete that we could almost count it whole, the animal whose weight 2 teams of careful people measured and could not agree on, one saying a great deal, the other saying rather less. That disagreement is not a wound. It is only the honest space between a bone and the living thing that once wore it. You can let it rest there, unresolved, and rest yourself, further back still. The individual shapes begin to blur into a single slow herd of memory. There is the longest one, the diplodocid, whose tail and neck ran out past any tape we have laid against it, the figures still being written down. There is the one known from a single vertebra wider than a dinner table, scaled up from cousins because it left us so little else. And there are the 2 great rivals of the far south, the heaviest animals ever to press the ground, so alike in scale that which of them wins depends only on whether you ask who is best known or who is likely biggest. Those are not the same question. They were never the same question. You do not have to choose. This was always the quiet truth beneath the ranking. A list of the largest is really a list of the best preserved, dressed up as certainty. The real giants may have been ones we will never name, whose bones washed away or were never buried or crumbled in the rain before anyone thought to draw them. We set those lost ones honestly to one side tonight, the vanished claimants, the numbers we cannot check. You're not going to lie awake over them. They are at peace, and so is the counting. Now the whole span is under you, and it is very wide and very slow. Watch how gently it all comes to rest. The end did not arrive as thunder for them. It arrived as a long thinning of the light, as plants that did not return the next season, as nests that stayed cold. The largest bodies need the most, and when the world gives less, the largest are the first to feel it. Across those final days the great herd simply grew quieter, and the low thud of a footfall through wet mud came less often, and then not at all. That is how the biggest walking things the earth has ever carried left it. Not with a roar, with a settling. Think of it the way still water takes a drop stone. There is the fall, and the small sound, and the rings spreading out, and then the surface closes over, smooth again, holding no mark of what went down. Deep time closed over the giants like that. Slow water, drawing shut. The rings widened until they touched every shore, and the pond lay flat and the animals were held somewhere far below the surface, unhurried, unbroken, kept. They are still down there. That is the strange comfort of it. Every bone you heard named tonight is real, is somewhere, is either in the ground still or under glass in a quiet hall, waiting without impatience. The largest femur is not lost. It is only sleeping in the rock, the way you are about to sleep, and it has been sleeping far longer than our whole kind has been awake. Let the view keep drawing back now, until the herds are only a shimmer on the floor of the water, until the continents themselves are soft shapes under drifting cloud. From up here you cannot tell one giant from another, and you do not need to. They blur into a single gentle weight, a long low line of enormous animals moving at a walk, always at a walk, never in a hurry, spending their whole days simply eating in the warm light. That was their life, slow and vast and calm. It suits the hour. The numbers can go now. You do not have to hold any of them. Let the tons and the feet and the millions of years loosen in your hands and drift down into the water with the rest. They were never the point. The point was only this, that the earth once carried bodies this large, and carried them softly, and closed over them softly, and remembers. Take one slow breath, and let the whole span settle. In the space of a single deep breath, 90 million years lies flat and quiet beneath you, the giants and their arguments and their vanished rivals all folded down into stillness. What felt like an eternity to them passed, in the long life of the planet, as barely a geological instant. And what feels like a long day to you will pass the same way, and be held the same way, gently, without loss. The water is smooth now, the rings are gone, the giants lie deep and undisturbed, and the surface shows only the soft light of a world still turning, still warm, still carrying whatever walks it now. You have come a long way through deep time tonight, farther than any footprint, past the tallest reach and the widest bone and the heaviest step ever taken on land. There is nothing left to reach for, nothing left to weigh, only the slow water closing and the warmth of your own quiet breathing and the long dark opening out ahead of you as gently as a plane at dusk. Let it carry you down. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.